He stood alone in the dirt yard with his father's revolver still smoking in his hand. He had just fired one round straight up into the Montana sky and shouted three words at God. Please send someone. He did not know that 400 miles away, the answer to that prayer was already walking toward him across half a continent, and that in 2 days a freight wagon would come roaring into his yard carrying a woman he had never asked for, a letter he had never written, and a secret that would change everything. Let me take you back to the cabin on the slope of the Bitterroots and tell you the story from the beginning. The single gunshot tore through the Montana evening like a blade through silk. Every bird within a mile lifted from the pines in a panicked rush of wings, scattering against the sky that was bleeding from gold to copper to the deep wounded purple of dusk. The echo rolled across the valley, struck the granite walls of the Bitterroot Mountains, and came rolling back. Changed somehow softer, more like a question than an answer, a man stood alone in the dirt yard of a log cabin 4,000 feet above the world. The revolver in his right hand was still pointed at the heavens. A thin ribbon of gun smoke curled from the barrel into the cold October air and disappeared into nothing the way prayers sometimes do. His name was Holden Ashbury. He was 28 years old, and he had just shouted at God. He had not meant to shout. He had meant to whisper the way a man whispers to a wife in the dark, the way his father used to whisper to his mother when he thought no one else was listening. But the silence on this mountain had grown so thick over the past 5 years that whispers got swallowed up before they could reach the sky. And so Holden Ashbury had pulled his father's old Colt from its peg above the fireplace, walked out into the yard, pointed the barrel at the first cold star of evening, and fired one round straight into eternity. And then he had said the words, just three of them, just enough. Please, send someone. His hands were trembling now as he lowered the weapon. It was not the cold he was used to. It was something else, something he had been carrying so long he had forgotten what it weighed. He stood there in the dust breath, frosting in front of his face, and stared up at the place where the bullet had vanished and waited. Nothing answered him. Nothing ever did. Listen carefully now, friend, because what I am about to tell you is not a story I made up. This is the kind of story that lives in old bones and old letters, the kind that gets passed down from grandfather to grandson on porches in the long blue twilight. 2 days from the moment Holden Ashbury fired that bullet at the sky, a freight wagon was going to come rolling into his yard carrying an unconscious woman, a letter addressed to the wrong brother, and an answer to the prayer he had not yet dared to believe in. And from the moment he lifted her down from that wagon bed and carried her across his threshold, nothing in his life would ever be the same again. Before we go any further, if you are new here, take a moment and tap the subscribe button. I share frontier stories like this one every week. And do me a small kindness. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are listening from tonight. The mountains, the highway, your kitchen table after supper, your workshop in the garage. I want to know who is out there in the dark with me listening. Now let me take you back to the cabin on the slope of the Bitterroots, back to the brothers who built it, back to the silence that almost killed a man before a stranger arrived to save him. The Ashbury Ranch sat at 4,000 feet on the western side of the Bitterroot Mountains, 15 miles of switchback road above the nearest town. The town was called Elkhorn, a dusty stitch of buildings clinging to the floor of a narrow valley, and it might as well have been on the other side of the world. The road that climbed up to the Ashbury place, crossed the creek 7 times, threaded itself through stands of ponderosa pines so thick the sun came through in long pale shafts like the inside of a cathedral, and ended finally at a wide clearing where 3 men had built themselves a kingdom out of nothing. The cabin was 5 rooms of hand-split pine and riverstone. Holden had cut every log himself. The barn could shelter 6 horses through the worst of winter. The fence line stretched for miles across terrain so rough that every post had been driven into the granite by the weight of his shoulders, every rail notched by the swing of his axe. 40 head of cattle grazed on the steep meadows above the tree line. There was a smokehouse where venison and elk were cured into sausages that would see them through to spring. There was a root cellar dug into the cold earth. There was a well that one of the brothers had spent 2 summers digging by hand until the water came up sweet and so cold it made your teeth ache. It was the kind of place a man builds when he has decided he does not need anyone else. And it was the kind of place a man becomes when he discovers too late that not needing anyone is a lie a heart tells itself to keep from breaking. The wound that made Holden Ashbury into the man he was had been carved into him 5 winters earlier during the bitter January of 1873. His mother went first. She was a school teacher before she married a woman who could quiet a crying baby and solve a column of arithmetic in the same breath. And she went the way good people sometimes do quietly in the small hours of the morning, with her hand resting on the family Bible. His father followed her 2 weeks later. There was no medical reason for it. The doctor in Elkhorn shrugged and said the heart was a strange organ. But Holden knew the truth. His father had simply decided that a world without his wife was not a world worth staying in, and he had stepped quietly out of it like a man stepping out of a coat at the end of a long day. Holden was 23 when he buried them. The ground was frozen so hard he had to swing the pickaxe for 2 days to open the graves. The blisters on his palms split and froze and split again. His brothers stood watching. The middle brother, Wesson, 20 years old then, had not said a single word the entire time. He just stared into the dark earth with those sharp green eyes of his, like a man staring at a wound that will never fully heal. The youngest Briggs, just 17 at the time, wept openly and without shame, as the youngest always do when they have not yet learned that grief is something you are supposed to swallow. 5 years had passed since that winter. 5 years of Holden carrying everything, the weight of two younger brothers who needed feeding and sheltering and guiding into manhood, the weight of a homestead that demanded constant labor just to keep from falling apart, the weight of every decision no one else could make, and the heaviest weight of all, the one no man could see, the one that pressed down on his chest in the small hours when sleep would not come, the loneliness. The bone-deep soul, grinding loneliness of a man who had built his world to need no one, and then woken up one morning to discover that needing no one and wanting no one were two very different things. A man keeps his word, his father had told him once. But Holden Ashbury had never had anyone to make promises to except himself. The door of the cabin creaked open behind him as he stood in the yard with a smoking revolver. He did not turn around. He did not have to. He could feel his middle brother in the doorway without needing to look. Wesson Ashbury did not say anything. He never did unless words were absolutely necessary, and they almost never were. He just stood there in the doorway with the lamplight from the cabin spilling around his shoulders, watching Holden the way he watched everything. Carefully, quietly. Wesson was 25 now, tall like his older brother, but lean, where Holden was broad-built for stealth and endurance rather than brute strength. His green eyes missed nothing. The forest had taught him how to listen, and the years after their parents died had taught him how to be still. There was a half-finished wood carving in his coat pocket, a small deer emerging from a block of pine. He carved when he was worried. He had been carving a lot lately. After a long moment, Wesson finally spoke. "You shot at the sky again." It was not a question. It was just a fact laid down between them like a card on a table. Holden lowered the revolver and turned to look at his brother. The two of them stood there in the dying light, neither one speaking, the kind of silence that only exists between men who have grown up sharing the same grief. "I needed to hear something," Holden said finally, even if it was just the echo. Wesson nodded once slowly. Then a third figure came running out of the barn behind them, all motion and grin and easy energy. Briggs Ashbury was 22 now. Tall like his brothers, 6'1", but with auburn hair the color of rusted iron, and the warm amber eyes of a young man who had decided long ago that the world was on balance a place worth smiling at. He was the sunshine in a house full of shadows. He was the one who named the horses. He was the one who could break a wild Mustang with patience instead of force. He was the one who 6 weeks ago had done something so quietly reckless that none of them yet knew it was about to change everything. "Star nearly jumped clean over the corral fence," Briggs said, jogging up to them. "You keep firing that thing, and she is going to learn to fly." Then he saw Holden's face, and the grin softened, and he laid one hand on his older brother's shoulder. It was an easy gesture, the kind of casual touch that only the youngest could get away with in a house this guarded. "You need sleep, Holden. You look like a man who has been dragged behind a wagon." Holden did not answer. He simply walked past his brothers, hung the Colt back on its peg above the fireplace, and lowered himself into the rocking chair their father had built by hand from mountain ash. The fire was burning low. He stared into it. Outside the cabin walls, the last light of October bled out of the sky, and the snow-capped peaks of the Bitterroots burned amber, and then faded to a deep coal blue, and then went black against the rising stars. What Holden did not know was this, what he could not have known. While he sat there staring into the dying fire, an answer to the prayer he had just shouted at the sky was sitting on a rattling stagecoach 400 miles to the east, clutching a small carpet bag in her lap and trying to keep herself from being sick. She was 22 years old. She had $4 to her name. There was a letter folded inside the bodice of her dress, a letter that had crossed half a continent to find her and would now cross the rest of it to bring her here. And somewhere on the long road between Boston and Montana, this young woman had begun to understand that the life she was running toward might be the only thing standing between her and a life she would not survive. But before we get to her, you need to know about the letter. And to know about the letter, you need to know what Briggs Ashbury did in the second week of September 1878 without telling a single soul. 6 weeks before Holden fired that bullet at the sky, the youngest Ashbury brother had walked into the post office in Elkhorn with an envelope in his coat pocket. The envelope was addressed to a newspaper in Boston, Massachusetts. Inside was a letter responding to an advertisement in the matrimonial section, the kind of advertisement that men in the Western Territories sometimes placed when there were no women within 100 miles, and a man got tired of his own cooking and his own thoughts and his own face in the shaving mirror. But the letter Briggs had written was different from the usual sort. He was not looking for a wife for himself. He was 22 years old and in no particular hurry, and besides, he had his eye on a red-haired girl in town named Maribel Donnelly, the blacksmith's daughter, though he had not yet worked up the courage to do anything about it. No, Briggs was looking for a wife for someone else. He was looking for a wife for Holden. He had watched his older brother's loneliness eating him alive for 5 long years. He had seen the way Holden carried the weight of all of them without ever asking for help. He had heard just 2 nights before he wrote the letter the sound of his older brother weeping in the barn at midnight, a sound so quiet and so terrible that Briggs had stood frozen in the kitchen with a cup of water in his hand and felt his heart break clean in two. Holden would never write such a letter himself, too proud, too stubborn, too afraid that hope once spoken aloud would be taken away from him like everything else had been. So Briggs had written it for him. The letter had been honest. He had used his own name because that was the only name he could legally sign. He had described the ranch as it was not as a paradise. "I will not promise you an easy life," the letter said. "Montana winters can kill a man and a woman both, and a homestead in the mountains is no tea parlor. But I will promise you truth. I will promise you respect. I will promise you a place where you will never have to pretend to be something you are not. If that is good enough for you, then you are good enough for us," he had told no one. Not Holden, who would have torn the letter to pieces. He had told only one person late one night when Holden was already asleep upstairs and the fire had burned down to coals. He had sat across from Wesson at the kitchen table and laid the whole plan out, his voice low, his hands shaking just slightly. Wesson had listened without interrupting, his fingers still moving in their slow, steady rhythm as he cleaned the barrel of his rifle. When Briggs finished, Wesson was silent for a long time, the kind of silence that from anyone else would have been uncomfortable. From Wesson, it was just the sound of a man thinking carefully. "Holden will lose his mind," Wesson said finally. "I know." Another silence, then quieter. "But you are right. He needs this." And that was all. Wesson had agreed to keep the secret, because if Holden found out before the woman arrived, he would write a cancellation letter so fast the ink would not have time to dry. The 2 younger brothers had shaken hands across the table in the lamplight, and they had waited. 3 weeks later, a reply had come back from Boston. The handwriting on the envelope was small and neat and feminine. The paper inside smelled faintly of lavender. The woman who had written it was named Cordelia Vance. She was 22 years old. And the letter she had sent was so honest, so intelligent, so quietly desperate, without ever quite saying so, that Briggs had read it 3 times in the back of the post office before he finally folded it up and walked home with the strangest feeling in his chest. The feeling that he had just done something far larger than he understood. He still had not told Holden. Now let me bring you to Cordelia. The stagecoach was rattling westward across the high plains of Dakota Territory when she first allowed herself to consider the possibility that she had made a terrible mistake. The wheels jolted over a rut and she nearly bit her tongue. The dust came in through every gap in the windows and settled into her hair, her eyelashes the collar of her navy blue traveling dress. She was the only passenger left on this leg of the journey. The other two had gotten off at the last station, and the driver up on the box was a stranger who had not said more than 4 words to her since dawn. She was a small woman, 5'3" in her shoes. Her hair was the color of honey held up to a window, and she wore it pinned in a modest knot at the back of her neck, though loose tendrils had escaped during the long ride and now framed her face in soft waves. Her eyes were the deep blue of cornflowers, large and watchful, with the kind of long dark lashes that made strangers stare longer than they meant to. She had a heart-shaped face and a small, straight nose, and a mouth that might have been pretty if it had not been pressed tightly closed against the dust and the worry and the knowledge that she had $4 left in her purse and nowhere to go but forward. Her name was Cordelia Vance, and she was a mail-order bride. She had not always been one. 3 years ago, she had been the daughter of a Boston bookseller and a piano teacher, an only child raised in a narrow brownstone on a quiet street with shelves of books in every room and the smell of her father's pipe tobacco in the curtains. Her mother had taught her to read music. Her father had taught her Latin and Greek and how to recognize a first edition by the way the binding was stitched. They had been a small, quiet, deeply contented family. And then in the autumn of her 19th year, the fever had come through the city, and within 10 days both her parents were dead, and Cordelia Vance had been left alone in a world that suddenly had no soft places in it. The bookshop was sold to pay her father's debts. The brownstone went next. By the end of that winter, she had nothing but a small inheritance, 2 trunks of clothes, her mother's wedding ring on a chain around her neck, and one distant aunt out west whom she had never met. She had taken a position as a governess to keep from starving. The position was with the family of a wealthy shipping magnate named Pemberton, whose 3 young children needed instruction in French and music and proper manners. The Pembertons lived in a great house on Beacon Hill. They paid her a fair wage. They treated her at first with cool but adequate kindness. And then the eldest son had decided he wanted her. His name was Thaddeus Pemberton. He was 30 years old, Harvard-educated, the heir to his father's shipping empire, and the kind of man who had never in his entire life been told no by anyone who mattered. He was tall, 6 feet, with black hair. He wore slicked back from a high forehead and gray eyes that held the temperature of a January creek. He was in his own polished way handsome. He was also the loneliest kind of man, though he himself did not know it. He had been raised by a father who treated love the way a banker treats a ledger: debit and credit, investment and return. Provide for a thing and you own it. Thaddeus had learned this lesson at his father's knee, and he had never thought to question it because no one in his entire life had ever shown him there might be another way. He decided he wanted Cordelia the way he might have decided he wanted a particular painting for his study. She was beautiful. She was educated. She would look well at the head of his table. He arranged the engagement without once asking her opinion, because in his world, opinions were something women might be permitted to have in private, but never in matters of consequence. When his mother announced the engagement at a Sunday dinner, Cordelia heard the news at the same moment the rest of the household did, with a fork halfway to her mouth and her face going slowly pale. She tried at first to be grateful. She told herself that gratitude was a kind of love, that safety was a kind of love, that perhaps the warmth she did not feel for Thaddeus would come in time. But the closer the wedding crept, the clearer it became that Thaddeus did not want a wife at all. He wanted a possession. He wanted a beautiful object that would smile and nod and never have an opinion about anything that mattered. And Cordelia Vance, whatever else she was not an object. 2 months before the wedding, on a cold February evening, she walked into the Pemberton Library and broke the engagement. The family erupted. Ungrateful, they called her. Selfish. A foolish girl who did not understand the gift she was being offered. Mrs. Pemberton wept into her handkerchief and demanded to know what was wrong with her son. The younger children stared at Cordelia with confused, frightened eyes. But the worst reaction, the one that would haunt her for months afterward, was Thaddeus himself. He did not shout. He did not weep. He simply looked at her across the library, his gray eyes flat and unblinking, and said one sentence in a voice so quiet she had to lean forward to hear it. "No one walks out of my life until I say so, Cordelia. You will regret this." That was the moment she understood that her life in Boston was over. She used the last of her parents' small inheritance to buy a stagecoach ticket west. She answered the only mail-order bride advertisement she could find in the back of a respectable matrimonial newspaper. She wrote her letter to a man named Briggs Ashbury in Montana Territory, a man whose words on the page had felt strangely honest in a city that had taught her to trust no one. And she ran, not just from Thaddeus, from the version of herself that Boston had been trying to make her into, from the small, obedient creature with the closed mouth and the lowered eyes, who would have spent the rest of her life serving tea in a house full of people who saw her as furniture. What she did not know as the stagecoach rattled westward through the dust of the Dakota Plains was that Thaddeus Pemberton had not let her go. He had simply waited. He had hired men, and those men were already moving west. But the first thing that nearly killed her was not Thaddeus. It was her own foolishness and the Montana sun. The stagecoach broke an axle 15 miles east of Elkhorn. The driver climbed down, examined the splintered wood, swore softly, and delivered the verdict. A day at least to make repairs, maybe two. They would have to wait for help. Cordelia looked out at the empty road. The October sun was directly overhead, white and merciless. The driver was already busy unhitching the horses. She thought of her $4. She thought of how already behind schedule she already was. She thought of Briggs Ashbury, the kind stranger whose letter she carried, who would be waiting in Elkhorn and would assume she had decided not to come if she did not arrive on time. She thought of how walking 15 miles in Boston would have meant passing through half a dozen neighborhoods. Surely it could not be so different here. It was the most foolish decision she had ever made in her life. She picked up her small carpet bag, told the driver she would walk on ahead and arrange help from the next station, and she set out alone along the dusty road with her shoes pinching her feet and her heart pounding with a strange kind of stubborn courage. The October heat in Montana is a deceiver. It looks like autumn. It feels like high summer. The air is so dry it pulls the moisture out of you with every breath, and the wind off the high country carries grit that scours the back of your throat. Cordelia walked for 2 hours before her water ran out. She walked another hour with the blisters rising on her heels and bursting against the leather of her city shoes. The landscape that had looked so beautiful from the stagecoach window now looked like a different planet. There was no shade. There was no water. There was no sign of human life in any direction. Just grass and rock and a sky so wide it made her dizzy to look up. By the third hour, her vision was blurring at the edges. By the fourth hour, her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. Her thoughts began to scatter, to come loose from each other like dry leaves coming loose from a branch in a strong wind. She found herself thinking about her mother's piano, about the way the afternoon light had fallen across the keys, about a particular Schubert piece she had never quite mastered. And then somewhere between one step and the next, her legs simply stopped working. She did not so much fall as discover that she was on her knees in the dust without remembering how she had gotten there. The carpet bag tipped over and a small book of poems slid out into the road. She tried to reach for it. Her arm would not obey her. The sky was very blue above her. The wind whispered through the dry grass, and somewhere far away a hawk was crying. It was in that moment, lying half-conscious in the dirt of a road in a country she did not know, with the sun hammering down on her face, that Cordelia Vance did something she had not done since the night her mother died. She prayed. She did not pray in the formal way she had been taught in church. She prayed the way a drowning person reaches for something to hold on to. Her lips barely moved. "Please," she whispered into the dust. "Please, God, just one more chance. Let someone find me. Let me have a place where I belong." And then her eyes closed, and the bright Montana sky went black. Two prayers, two strangers, one standing on a mountaintop shouting his loneliness at the heavens, one lying face down in the dust of a high plains road. Neither one knew the other existed. But the strange thing about prayers, if you have lived long enough to pay attention, is that sometimes they do not get answered the way you expect. Sometimes they get answered the way you needed all along. The man who found her was not a man Cordelia would ever have chosen to put her life in the hands of, and that perhaps is exactly why God sent him. His name was Cobb Whitfield. He was 53 years old. He was a freight driver who hauled supplies from Helena down through the Bitterroot Valley and back again twice a month, the same route, for nearly 20 years. He was a widower. His wife had died of consumption a long time ago, and he had never remarried. He had hands like leather and a face like a creased map and a heart that he kept hidden behind a permanent expression of weather-worn skepticism. But Cobb Whitfield had also seen enough trouble in his time to know it when it was lying in the middle of the road, and when the wheels of his freight wagon came around a bend in the late afternoon, and he saw the small, dark shape sprawled in the dust ahead, he did not hesitate for even a second. He pulled the team up, climbed down from the box, knelt beside her in the dirt, and laid 2 fingers against the soft place under her jaw where the pulse beats. There it was. Faint. Too fast. But there. He felt the heat coming off her skin, and he understood at once that this was a fever, not just exhaustion, that the long walk in the sun had cooked something inside her that needed to be cooled before it killed her. He looked up the road. He looked down the road. He calculated distances in his head. The doctor in Elkhorn was out. He had passed the dock on the road that very morning, heading north to deliver a baby at a homestead on the other side of the divide. The nearest place with a roof and a bed and clean water was the Ashbury Ranch. 7 miles up the mountain. Cobb Whitfield made his decision the way he made every decision in his life, quickly and without fuss. He gathered the unconscious woman into his arms. He laid her gently in the bed of the freight wagon, on top of a folded canvas tarp between 2 crates of dry goods and a sack of flour. He tucked her own carpet bag in beside her. He picked up the small book of poems from the road and set it next to her hand, and then he climbed back onto the box and turned the team toward the mountain. The sun was setting behind the Bitterroots when the freight wagon came roaring into the Ashbury yard. Holden was in the barn. He had been mucking stalls for the better part of an hour, working with grim mechanical purpose. Wesson was in the smokehouse turning meat. Briggs was up on the roof of the cabin replacing a shake that had come loose in the last big wind. All 3 brothers heard the wagon at the same moment, the sound of wheels on the hard pack at speed. A driver shouting. The shout was shaped like a name, and the name was Holden's. Holden came out of the barn at a run, a pitchfork still in one hand. He saw the wagon. He saw Cobb Whitfield up on the box hat, shoved back, face urgent. He saw something else. Something in the wagon bed that did not belong there. Holden Cobb shouted, "Thank God you are here. I need your help, and I need it now." Holden did not stop running until he was at the side of the wagon. He looked down into the bed, and there she was. She was lying on the canvas tarp among the flour sacks and the supply crates. Her face was the color of paper. Her honey blonde hair had come loose from its pins and was tangled across her forehead, plastered to her temples with the sweat of fever. Her navy blue traveling dress was filthy with dust and torn at one knee. There was a small cameo brooch at her throat, and her hands were folded one over the other on her chest like the hands of someone who had given up. She looked small. She looked broken. She looked to a man who had just 2 days earlier shouted a desperate prayer at the sky like the shape of an answer he had not yet dared to believe in. Found her 10 miles east, was saying the words coming fast. Walking. Walking, can you believe it, in this heat with nothing but that little bag? Collapsed in the road. Fever is bad. She needs cold water and a bed, and she needs them right now. Doc Miller is over the divide. Your place was the closest thing with a roof. I figured you would help. Holden was already climbing into the wagon bed. He did not waste a single second on words. He slid one arm beneath her shoulders and the other beneath her knees, and he lifted her, and she was lighter than he had expected. Or perhaps the urgency made her seem so. He could feel the heat of her fever burning right through the fabric of her dress. Her head fell against his shoulder as he lifted her, and her breath was so shallow he could barely feel it on his neck. Wesson had appeared from the smokehouse and was already moving toward the cabin door, holding it open. Briggs had come down off the roof so fast he had nearly fallen and was now running for the well with a wooden bucket. Nobody had given any orders. Nobody needed to. The Ashbury brothers had spent 5 years learning how to act together without speaking, like a wolf pack, like men who have only each other in the world. Holden carried her across the yard and over the threshold of the cabin and into his own bedroom, the only one with a real bed. Wesson had already turned back the quilt. The quilt was the last thing their mother had ever sewn, a patchwork of blue and green and faded gold, and Holden laid the unconscious woman down on it as gently as if he were laying down something made of glass. She stirred once. Her lips moved. No sound came out. Then she was still again. Cobb Whitfield stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, giving instructions in his quiet, practical voice. Cool cloths every 15 minutes. Small sips of water if she would take them. Watch the breathing. Watch the color around the lips. He could not stay. He had a load of dry goods bound for Silver City and a contract that would not wait. He clapped Holden on the shoulder, once gave a brief nod to the other two brothers, and was gone. The sound of his wagon faded down the mountain road, and the three Ashbury brothers were left standing in a small bedroom around a stranger. It was Briggs who saw the carpet bag. It had fallen from Holden's grip when he lifted the woman, and now it lay on the floor at the foot of the bed, half open, its contents spilling out. A folded shawl, a small leather-bound copy of poems, a wooden hairbrush, and something else, a folded letter, the paper soft with handling, the wax seal long since broken. Briggs picked up the letter without quite knowing why. He unfolded it. He saw the handwriting on the paper, his own handwriting. He saw the words at the top of the page written in his own hand 6 weeks ago in the back room of the Elkhorn post office. "I will not promise you an easy life, Miss Vance." He saw the signature at the bottom, his own name, Briggs Ashbury. Every drop of color drained from his face. He stood there in the lamplit bedroom, holding the letter as if it were a snake he had just realized was alive. He looked up at Holden. Holden was kneeling beside the bed, pressing a damp cloth against the woman's burning forehead, his whole attention bent on her. Briggs opened his mouth and discovered that no sound was going to come out of it. He closed it again. He looked at Wesson. Wesson was watching him with those sharp green eyes, and Wesson, who missed nothing, had already understood. Briggs walked slowly around the bed until he was standing where his older brother could see him. He held out the letter. "Holden," he said, and his voice was scraped raw. "You need to read this." Holden looked up. He saw the letter. He saw his brother's face. Something in his chest went very still. "What is it?" "Just read it." Holden took the letter. He read it standing up. His amber eyes moved across the page, once fast, then again slower, taking in every word. When he reached the signature at the bottom, he did not move. He did not speak. He just stood there with the paper in one hand and the damp cloth in the other, and looked at his youngest brother with an expression that Briggs had never seen on his face before. It was not anger, not yet. It was something colder than anger. It was the look of a man who has just discovered that the ground he was standing on is not where he thought it was. "What did you do, Briggs?" Briggs could not answer. His throat had locked. "What did you do?" The silence in that bedroom was the kind that could crack stone. In the bed, the unconscious woman drew a ragged breath and let it out again. The fire in the next room popped softly. Outside the cabin walls, a single owl called once across the cold, dark slope of the mountain. Holden looked down at the woman on the bed. The woman who had crossed half a continent to marry one of the Ashbury brothers. Just not the one whose hands were holding the cool cloth against her burning face. He looked at the letter in his other hand. He looked back at Briggs. "We will talk about this," Holden said, and his voice was very quiet, very controlled, like a voice that promises a storm has not yet arrived but is on its way. "We will talk about this, but not now." He folded the letter once and handed it to Wesson without looking at him. He wrung the cloth out fresh in the basin of Cold Creek, water on the bedside table. He laid it across the woman's forehead. He pulled the wooden chair from the corner of the room and set it beside the bed. He lowered himself into it, and he began the vigil that would last for the next 3 days. Wesson and Briggs stood in the doorway watching their oldest brother for a long moment. Then Wesson put a hand on Briggs's shoulder and steered him out of the room and closed the door softly behind them. Briggs let himself be steered. He felt as though he had just lit a fuse and was now waiting to see whether the explosion would build a house or burn one down. Inside the bedroom, Holden Ashbury sat in the chair beside the bed of a stranger and watched her breathe. He did not yet know her name. He did not yet know what she was running from. He did not yet know that 2 days earlier he had stood in the yard of his own ranch and shouted a prayer at the sky, and that the woman lying in front of him was the answer to that prayer, just not in the shape he had ever expected an answer to take. What he did know, sitting there in the lamplight, with the cool cloth in one hand and his mother's quilt under the other, was that something inside him had shifted the moment he lifted her down from the freight wagon. Something that had been frozen for 50 long years had begun very quietly to thaw. He did not have a name for the feeling yet. He would not have a name for it for many weeks to come, but the feeling was there, and it would not be put back where it had come from. Outside the cabin, a cold wind began to move down off the high peaks, the first true breath of winter. The Bitterroot stood black against the sky full of stars. And in a town 15 miles away, in a hotel room, He had taken under his own name a man with slicked black hair and gray eyes the color of January creek water, was unfolding a telegram from his hired investigator and reading the address of the Ashbury Ranch for the very first time. Thaddeus Pemberton smiled. It was not a warm smile. He folded the telegram. He poured himself a glass of brandy from a silver flask. He looked out at the window of the hotel at the dusty street of Elkhorn and at the dark mountain beyond, where somewhere in the night a woman who had once belonged to him was lying in the bed of a stranger. "You will regret this, Cordelia," he said quietly to the window. "You said you wanted a place where you belong. I am going to show you that the only place you belong is where I tell you to be." And in the bedroom of the cabin on the mountain, a tall man with whiskey-colored eyes wrung out a cloth in cold water and laid it once again across the burning forehead of a woman whose name he did not yet know. The fire crackled, the wind pressed against the log walls, and outside the first thin flakes of an early snow began to drift down out of the great, cold, dark, soft, and quiet, and meant for someone in particular who had been waiting a very long time to be found. The fever held her for 2 more days. Holden did not leave the chair beside the bed for any of it, except to walk to the door and accept the cup of strong black coffee Briggs brought him every few hours, or to step outside long enough to splash creek water on his face when his eyelids grew too heavy to lift. He learned the shape of the woman's breathing, the way a man learns the shape of a path he walks every day. He learned the small sounds she made when the fever spiked. He learned the moment when she would shiver beneath the quilt and he would need to bank the fire higher in the front room so the heat would carry down the short hallway to where she lay. Wesson took over every chore on the ranch without being asked. He fed the chickens. He mucked the stalls. He chopped the day's firewood. He walked the perimeter at first light and again at dusk, his sharp green eyes reading the trees, the trail, the soft ground along the creek. For any sign that did not belong, he brought back 2 rabbits one morning and a brace of grouse the next, and he cleaned them on the back porch in silence, and Briggs cooked them down into a thin broth that Holden could try to spoon between the woman's lips when she surfaced enough to swallow. That was Wesson's whim. He did not offer comfort with words. He offered action. Steady, silent, unfailing action. And there was one small thing he did during those 3 days that none of his brothers ever knew about, because he never told them and would not have known how to explain it if asked. Every morning before sunrise, he heated a tin cup of water on the stove until it was just warm enough to wash a face. He carried the cup down the short hallway and set it on the small wooden stool outside the bedroom door. He did this in case the woman, when she finally woke, might want to wash the fever sweat from her face and feel like a person again. He never said a word about it to anyone. He simply did it every single morning like a man leaving wildflowers on a grave he cannot bear to speak of. Briggs cooked. Briggs carried wood. Briggs went to the barn 3 times a day to talk quietly to Star, his favorite mare, because the talking helped him keep his hands from shaking. The guilt was sitting on his chest like a stone. He had brought this woman to his brother's house. He had set this whole thing in motion, and now she might die in the bed of a man whose name she had never even heard. And it would be his fault, and the words to say so would not come. On the second night of the vigil, somewhere in the deep cold hours when even the wind on the mountain seemed to be holding its breath, Cordelia Vance opened her eyes for the first time. The lamp on the bedside table was burning low. The light it cast was the color of old gold. She did not know where she was. She did not remember the road, or the falling, or the hands that had lifted her down from the wagon bed. She knew only that her mouth was very dry and her body felt as if it had been packed in hot sand, and that someone was sitting beside her in the dark. She turned her head on the pillow. Just an inch. There was a man in the chair beside the bed. He was very large. The lamplight caught the side of his face, the strong line of his jaw. The 2-day stubble, the high cheekbone, and one open eye the color of whiskey held up to a candle. He was watching her, not looming over her, not crowding her, just watching as a man watches a fire he is responsible for keeping alive. She tried to speak. Her lips moved. No sound came out. He understood at once. He reached for the cup of cool water on the bedside table with Aguar without ever taking his eyes off her face. He cradled the back of her head in his palm, the way a man cradles something fragile he is afraid of breaking, and brought the rim of the cup to her cracked lips. His touch was so unexpectedly careful that for a moment Cordelia forgot to be afraid. She drank. 2 slow swallows. 3. The water was the cleanest thing she had ever tasted in her life. It tasted like a creek that ran straight down off snow. He took the cup away before she could ask for more. A little, he said quietly. His voice was deeper than she had been expecting. Not loud, not soft, just deep the way the lowest note of a church organ is deep. A little now, more in a few minutes. Your body will not know what to do with too much at once. She let her head sink back into the pillow. Her eyes did not leave his face, where she whispered, "My ranch." He said it as though she had asked a normal question on a normal day. About 15 miles outside of Elkhorn, in the Bitterroot Mountains, a freight driver named Cobb Whitfield found you on the road 2 days ago. You had a bad fever. You still do. But it is breaking now. She closed her eyes for a moment. She tried to remember the road. She tried to remember walking. She remembered only the blue of the sky and the cry of a hawk and the strange certainty in the moment before she fell that she was about to die alone in a country where nobody knew her name. Her eyes opened again. Who, she whispered. Holden, he said. Just the one word. He did not give her his last name. He did not give her any of the rest of it. He understood in some quiet, instinctive way that she could not yet hold the weight of more than one word at a time. Holden, she repeated. It came out of her mouth as something halfway between a name and a prayer. Then her eyes drifted shut again, and she was asleep, and her breathing was a little easier than it had been an hour before, and Holden Ashbury sat very still in the chair beside her bed and discovered that he was crying without making any sound at all. The fever broke just before dawn on the third morning. She woke to gray light at the window and the smell of wood smoke and a quiet that was different from any quiet she had ever heard in Boston. There was no rattle of carriages. There was no shouting of vendors in the street. There was only the sound of a fire crackling somewhere in the next room, the low conversation of two men trying to keep their voices down, and outside the window, very far away, the call of an animal she did not recognize. The chair beside the bed was empty. She turned her head and saw a folded square of clean cloth on the small wooden stool just inside the doorway. Beside it, a tin cup of water that was still slightly warm. She did not know yet that Wesson had set it there an hour before sunrise, the way he had set one there every morning of the vigil just in case. She only knew that someone in this house had been thinking of her even while she was unconscious, and that the someone had done it without expecting thanks. She sat up, slowly. Her arms were trembling. She washed her face with the warm water in the clean cloth and felt the fever sweat come away from her skin. She pinned her hair back as best she could with the pins she found tucked into the pocket of her dress, which someone had laid carefully across the foot of the bed. She straightened her collar. She took a long, slow breath, and then on legs that felt like green wood, Cordelia Vance walked out of the bedroom and into the front room of the cabin to meet the men who had saved her life. 3 of them. 3 of them, not one. She stopped in the hallway when she saw them because the math was wrong and her tired brain could not at first make it come out right. Holden was standing at the front window, his back to her, looking out at the gray dawn. She knew it was Holden because of the size of him and because she remembered somewhere under the fog of fever the deep voice and the careful hand on the back of her head. There was another man at the kitchen table, slightly smaller, lean and quiet, with chestnut hair and eyes the color of new spring leaves. And there was a third man crouched at the hearth, feeding kindling to the fire. An auburn-haired young man who looked up as she came into the room and went perfectly white in the face. 3 brothers. She had crossed half a continent to marry one mountain man, and she had arrived to find 3. Holden turned at the sound of her step in the hallway. His eyes found her at once. He did not move. None of the brothers moved. They stood and sat exactly where they were, like men standing very still when a deer steps unexpectedly into a clearing, because any sudden motion will scare the deer back into the trees. "You should be in bed," Holden said. "I should," she agreed, "but I would rather not be." Her voice was thin, but it was steady, and the steadiness in it surprised all 3 of them, including her. Holden gestured slowly at the rocking chair beside the fire, the chair their father had built. She crossed the room and lowered herself into it, and the auburn-haired young man at the hearth scrambled to his feet and pulled a wool blanket from the back of the chair and draped it carefully across her shoulders without quite meeting her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded once and stepped back, and his ears were burning red. The lean, quiet brother at the table stood up. He was as tall as Holden, but built differently. He moved with the economy of a hunting dog, no waste in any motion. Wesson, he said, naming himself. He did not offer his hand. He offered only the name and a small, careful nod, and somehow that felt more honest than any handshake she had ever received in Boston. Briggs said, the auburn-haired one, finally finding his voice. The youngest. His eyes finally came up to meet hers, and there was something in them that was not quite shame and not quite hope, and she did not yet know what it was. Holden, said the man at the window, though she already knew. She drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She looked at each of them in turn. Then she said the words she had been rehearsing for the entire long stagecoach journey from Boston, though she had never expected to be saying them in a room full of 3 men instead of 1. My name is Cordelia Vance. I came from Boston. I answered an advertisement. I had a letter, I think it was in my bag. A small movement passed through the room, almost too small to see. Briggs glanced at Holden. Holden glanced at Wesson. Wesson said nothing at all. And Cordelia Vance, who had been sharpening her instincts on the polished cruelties of the Pemberton household for 3 full years, saw the look pass between the brothers and understood at once that something was wrong. Something to do with the letter. Where is my bag? She asked quietly. Holden walked to the corner of the room and picked it up and brought it to her. He set it down on the floor at her feet. She opened it with hands that still trembled slightly. The shawl was there. The book of poems was there. The wooden hairbrush was there. The letter was on top of everything else, refolded carefully along its original creases, the wax seal long since broken. She lifted the letter. She looked up at the 3 brothers. Which one of you is Briggs Ashbury? She asked. Briggs raised one hand slowly, like a boy raising his hand in a schoolroom when he knows he is in trouble. Then this letter said, Cordelia Vance, holding the paper up between 2 fingers, is from you. Yes, ma'am. She looked at him for a long moment. He was 22 years old. She could see it now in the openness of his face. He was younger than she was. He was younger than the brother at the window, who must be at least 25 or 6. And he was younger by a wide margin than the man who had sat beside her bed for 3 nights and held a cup of water to her lips with hands that had never once trembled. Cordelia Vance was an intelligent woman. She had been an intelligent woman from the time she was 4 years old and had taught herself to read by following her father's finger across the page. The pieces of this thing were already arranging themselves in her mind, and she did not like the shape they were making. Mr. Ashbury, she said to Briggs very calmly. Did you write this letter for yourself? Briggs swallowed. No, ma'am. Holden's head came around very slowly. Wesson at the table did not move at all, but Cordelia saw his hand close very gently around the carving knife that lay beside the half-finished wooden deer in front of him. Not as a threat, as a habit, the way some men reach for a door frame in a strong wind. For who then? Said Cordelia. Briggs's mouth opened and closed. His ears were the color of a new brick. For me, said Holden. The whole room turned. He was still standing at the window. The dawn light was on his face now, and Cordelia saw his expression for the first time in full daylight. She saw the strong square jaw and the high cheekbones and the slight bump on the bridge of his nose where it had been broken once long ago. She saw the whiskey-colored eyes. She saw the exhaustion in him, the 3 days without sleep, the hollow places under the eyes. And she saw something else, something she had not seen on a man's face in all her years in Boston. She saw a man who was bracing himself to be hated. He wrote it for me, Holden said, without my knowing. I did not see your letter, Miss Vance, until 2 days ago, when we found it in your bag. The first time I knew you existed in this world was the moment Cobb Whitfield drove his freight wagon into my yard and said he had a sick woman in the back. Cordelia looked down at the letter in her hand. The handwriting on the page was careful and round and slightly boyish. It was not the handwriting of the man at the window. It could not have been. The man at the window did not have boyish handwriting in him anywhere. She looked back up at Holden. You did not ask for me, she said quietly. No, he said. I did not. You did not even know I was coming. No, ma'am. She was silent for a long moment. The fire popped softly in the hearth. Outside the window, somewhere on the slope of the mountain, an early bird called once and went still. Then Cordelia Vance, who weighed less than 110 pounds and had been on her feet for less than 20 minutes, and was sitting in a strange cabin in a country whose rules she did not yet understand, surrounded by 3 enormous men whose intentions toward her were a complete mystery, did something that none of the Ashbury brothers would forget for the rest of their lives. She lifted her chin, she straightened her spine against the back of the rocking chair, She looked Holden Ashbury directly in the eyes, and she asked him a question that no woman had ever asked any of them before. "Then I would like to ask you something, Mr. Ashbury," she said, "and I would like an honest answer because I am too tired and too far from home for anything else." "Ask it," said Holden. "The decency you have shown me, the bed you gave me, the water, the 3 nights you sat in that chair. I know you sat in it. I could feel you there even when I could not open my eyes. The decency, Mr. Ashbury, what does it cost?" The room went perfectly still. Wesson's hand left the carving knife. Briggs took half a step back without meaning to. And Holden Ashbury, the eldest brother, the man who had carried the weight of his whole family on his shoulders for 5 long years without ever once being asked what it cost him, looked down at the small woman in the rocking chair and felt something inside his chest that he had not felt since the morning he buried his mother. He felt understood, not pitied, not admired, understood, by a stranger, by a woman who had been awake for less than an hour and had already seen straight through to the place inside him where the loneliness lived. He was quiet for so long that Briggs began to fidget. Then Holden walked slowly across the room until he was standing about 3 feet from the rocking chair, far enough to give her the distance she needed close enough to be heard. He did not crouch down. He did not loom. He simply stood there in his big stocking feet on the worn pine floor, and he gave her his answer in the same low, even voice he used for everything that mattered. "It cost nothing, Miss Vance." She watched his face. "In Boston," she said, "I lived with people who called themselves decent. They gave me a home and clothes and an education. And every act of decency had a price tag on it that they collected when it suited them. So I will ask you again, because I have learned the hard way to ask twice. What does your decency cost?" Holden held her eyes. "When you are well," he said, "I will need you to tell me what you want to do next. That is the only thing it costs. If you want to go back to Boston, I will ride you to Elkhorn, myself, and pay for your stagecoach ticket, and you will never see any of us again. If you want to stay in Elkhorn for a time and figure out what comes next, I will speak to your aunt and to the women I trust in town, and you will have a respectable place to stay until you decide. If you want to stay here in this house until you are strong enough to make a real choice, you may have my room. I will sleep in the loft above the barn. No one in this cabin will touch you. No one will ask anything of you. No one will collect anything. I am not in the business of buying women, Miss Vance. The man who wrote that letter to you was my brother, and he had no right to sign my name to a promise he could not keep. But I will tell you this. The promise itself, the words in the letter, the part about truth and respect in a place where you do not have to pretend that part is true, that part costs nothing. Because it is who I try to be on my best days, and it is who I will try to be every day you are under this roof." Cordelia did not move for a very long time. Then she nodded once. Just once. Slowly. "Thank you, Mr. Ashbury." "Holden," he said. "Holden," she repeated. And it was the second time she had said his name. And it landed differently this time, the way a stone lands differently when it is dropped into still water than when it is dropped onto dry ground. "I will stay," she said, "until I am strong enough to know what I want. I will pay for my keep by cooking and by mending and by whatever else a woman can do in a house full of men who clearly need a woman's hand on the curtains. And I will not be a burden. Do not call me one. I will work for my place here the same as any of you." She looked at Wesson. "I am sorry to make extra work for you in your kitchen." Wesson said nothing. He just gave her a single small nod. But the corner of his mouth, the corner that almost never moved, lifted by the smallest fraction of an inch. Briggs saw it. Briggs's eyes went wide. He had not seen Wesson's mouth do that since the winter their father died. She looked at Briggs. "And you, Mr. Ashbury," she said gently, "are going to tell me when I am strong enough to hear it exactly why you wrote that letter for your brother. Because I think the answer is going to be a kind one, and I would like to hear it in your own words." Briggs nodded fast, not trusting his voice. She looked finally back at Holden. "Now, if it is not too much trouble," she said, and her voice was beginning to fray at the edges with the effort of all this speech, "I would very much like a bowl of whatever your brother has been making in that pot on the stove. Because I have not eaten anything in 4 days that I can remember, and a person cannot make wise decisions on an empty stomach." Wesson was on his feet before she finished the sentence. He was already lifting the lid off the iron pot. The smell of rabbit broth and wild onion drifted out into the cabin, and Cordelia closed her eyes for a moment and let it fill her up. It smelled like food cooked by a man who knew what he was doing. It smelled like a place where, against every reasonable expectation, she might just possibly survive. The first day Cordelia was strong enough to walk on her own, Briggs gave her the tour of the place. He started with the cabin itself. 5 rooms, the front room with its great stone hearth, the kitchen with its black iron stove that the brothers had hauled up the mountain road 2 summers ago, an operation that had nearly killed all 3 of them. The small room in the back where Wesson slept, neat as a barracks, his rifle on a rack on the wall, and a row of wooden carvings along the windowsill. The loft above where Briggs slept, accessible only by a ladder, the rafters hung with bundles of dried herbs and strips of cured meat, and the bedroom that had been Holden's until 4 nights ago and was now hers. He took her out into the yard. The barn, 6 stalls, Star, his favorite mare, the wild Mustang, he had broken himself 2 summers earlier, with patience and apple slices and not a single rough hand. The other horses, the big draft team that pulled the plow and the wagon, the smokehouse, the root cellar dug deep into the hillside, cold as a winter cave even in summer. The chicken coop where the hens scattered away from her skirts, and she laughed at them, the first laugh that had been heard in the Ashbury yard in longer than any of them could remember. Holden was up on the roof of the barn replacing a shingle when he heard that laugh, and he stopped with his hammer raised and held perfectly still, listening as if he were trying to memorize a sound he was afraid he would never hear again. The well, the pump, the vegetable garden, where the last of the autumn potatoes still waited to be dug. The view up past the upper meadow where the cattle were grazing in long, slow lines against the dark wall of the timber, and beyond them the bare granite slopes climbing up and up into the snow. She stood in the yard with Briggs beside him and turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. The wind off the high country touched her face. Somewhere on the slope above them, an elk bugled a long, mournful note that rose and fell and faded into the trees. "Mr. Ashbury," she said softly. "Briggs." "Yes, ma'am, it is very beautiful here. It can kill you in 11 different ways before breakfast, ma'am." "I believe you," she said, "but it is still very beautiful." Briggs looked at her for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "He is a good man, ma'am. My brother, the best man I have ever known. He just does not know how to ask for anything ever. So I asked for him. I am sorry I did it the way I did, but I am not sorry I did it." Cordelia Vance turned her face away from him, toward the mountain, so that he would not see what was in her eyes. By the second week, she had begun to learn the rhythms of the place. She rose before the sun the way the brothers did, because the cabin was cold and the fire needed building, and the day did not wait for anyone in country like this. She learned to coax the iron stove into life with kindling and patience. She learned that Holden ground the coffee beans himself in a small stone mortar every morning, and that the smell of that coffee, dark and smoky and faintly bitter, mingled with the smell of pine smoke from the fire, would become from that moment forward, and for the rest of her natural life, the smell she most associated with the word home. She learned to gather eggs from hens that fought her for everyone. She learned to pump water without losing half of it down her sleeve. She learned that creek water in October was cold enough to numb her hands in 15 seconds and clean enough to drink without boiling. She burned the first batch of pancakes she ever made on a wood stove. Briggs ate them anyway. He declared them character building. He ate 4 of them and asked for more. Wesson took 1 bite and chewed it slowly and said very seriously, "You will get the hang of it." And Holden, when she set the plate down in front of him with her face burning red, picked up the blackest pancake on the plate and ate it without a single word and without taking his eyes off her face. And the look in those eyes said more clearly than any sentence ever could that he would have eaten a plate of charcoal if she had been the one to set it in front of him. She taught Briggs to read better in the evenings by lamplight. He could manage simple words, but he was slow, with the harder ones sounding out the syllables the way a boy of 12 might. She used her mother's small leather book of poems as a primer. He sat across the kitchen table from her, with his auburn head bent over the page and his big calloused hands turning each sheet with absurd care, and when he finally read a whole sentence aloud without stumbling, his face lit up with such open delight that Cordelia laughed out loud in pure pleasure. And in the corner of the room, sitting in deep shadow with a piece of pine And his carving knife, Wesson Ashbury was listening too. He never asked for a lesson. He never sat at the table. But Cordelia noticed by the third evening that she had begun leaving the book open at the right page on the corner of the table when she went to bed, and that in the morning the book was always closed again and set carefully back on the shelf. She never said a word about it. Neither did he. Wesson took her into the woods one bright cold afternoon and taught her how to read the ground. He showed her bear tracks in the soft mud, beside the creek, the wide round print of the foot, the long curve of the claws. He showed her the difference between a rattlesnake's belly trail and a bull snake's belly trail. He taught her which sounds in the timber were normal and which sounds meant that something with teeth was watching her. When she asked him how he had learned all of this, he gave her his usual brief answer. "The mountain teaches," he said, "if you live long enough to learn." Holden began to bring her wildflowers. He never said he was bringing them. He never handed them to her. He simply stopped on his way back from the upper meadow each evening and picked whatever was still blooming despite the cold. A few late asters, a sprig of yarrow, a single stem of fireweed gone to silver seed. He carried them home in his weathered, working hand, and he set them on the windowsill of her bedroom while she was busy in the kitchen, and he never once admitted to it. The first morning she found them there, she stood in the middle of the bedroom for a long time looking at the small, bright bundle on the sill and trying to keep her face from doing what it wanted to do. The second morning there were more. The third morning more still. She never asked who had left them. He never said. Briggs noticed by the end of the first week, and Briggs opened his mouth to make a joke about it at supper, and Wesson kicked him so hard under the table that Briggs nearly choked on his stew. Briggs did not say a word. After that, the wildflowers on the windowsill became a quiet, sacred thing in the cabin, the kind of thing all four of them knew about, and none of them mentioned the way you do not point at a doe in the meadow at first light, because the pointing will frighten her into the trees. And in the long blue evenings when the supper dishes were washed and the fire was banked low and the brothers had gone out to the barn for the final check on the animals, Cordelia and Holden began very slowly, very carefully to talk to each other on the porch. The two rocking chairs faced west. The sun went down behind the bitterroots in long, slow waves of amber and rose and deep purple. The first stars came out one by one over the eastern ridge. And Cordelia Vance, the bookseller's daughter from Boston, and Holden Ashbury, the eldest brother of a ranch on a mountain, traded small pieces of themselves into the cooling air, the way two people trade pieces when they are not yet ready to call it what it is. "Tell me about your mother," she said one evening. He told her about the way his mother had read aloud to her three sons every single night by lamplight, even when she was tired, even when she was sick, about the schoolhouse where she had taught before she married, about the songs she used to sing in the kitchen when she did not know anyone was listening. "Tell me about your father," he said another evening. She told him about the bookshop on the narrow Boston street, about the smell of pipe tobacco in the curtains, about the small peppermint candies he had kept in the pocket of his vest and given to her one at a time as a reward when she finished her Latin lessons. They did not touch. They did not speak of the future. They did not speak of the letter, or of Briggs, or of Boston. They just sat side by side in the cooling October dark and watched the mountains turn from gold to blue to black, and they breathed the same air and very slowly, in the way two careful animals approach each other across an open meadow, they began to trust the air between them. What neither one of them yet knew on those first quiet evenings on the porch was that the warmth of the cabin had already been spotted from a distance. 2 miles south of the Ashbury yard at the edge of the timber, where the trail came up out of the lower valley, Wesson Ashbury found a single boot print in the soft earth on the morning of the 10th day. It was narrow. It was heeled. It was the kind of boot a man buys in a city store and wears on cobblestone streets, not the kind of boot a man wears to hunt elk in the Bitterroots. Beside the boot print ground into the dirt was the stub of a hand-rolled cigarette made from tobacco that smelled when Wesson lifted it to his nose of an Eastern brand that no shop in Elkhorn carried. He did not tell Cordelia. He did not tell Briggs. He waited until Holden came back from the upper meadow that evening, and he met him at the gate of the corral, and he said three words very quietly in the lengthening dusk. "We are watched." And Holden Ashbury, who had been smiling for the first time in 5 years on his way down off the mountain because he had picked a particularly nice handful of late asters for the windowsill, felt the smile go off his face like a lamp going out in a sudden draft. He looked at his brother. He looked at the dark wall of the timber south of the cabin. He looked back toward the house where the first lamp of the evening had just been lit in the front window, and a small, honey-haired figure was moving across the lit square of glass, setting the table for supper. How many, he asked. Wesson held up one finger. Then after a moment, he held up a second. Holden's jaw set in a way it had not set in a long time. The rifle came down off the wall above the fireplace that night and was placed beside Holden's chair at supper. Cordelia looked at it once and said nothing. She had been a Pemberton governess for 3 years, and she knew the look of a man preparing for something he did not yet want to name. She set Holden's plate in front of him. She set Wesson's plate. She set Briggs's plate. She sat down across from Holden in the place that had become hers without anyone ever quite saying so, and she folded her small hands in her lap and bowed her head. And in a voice so quiet only Holden could hear it, she said grace over the food. Lord, she said, thank you for this meal and for this roof and for the hands that built it. And please watch over the men at this table. Amen. Holden did not say amen back. Holden Ashbury said nothing at all. He just looked across the table at the small woman who had walked 4,000 miles into his house and into his heart in less than 2 weeks, and he made a silent promise to a God he did not entirely believe in. The storm came at 10:30 the next morning, exactly when Wesson said it would. It came down off the high peaks the way storms in the Bitterroots always come down, not as a thing that arrives, but as a thing that simply takes over the world. The sky over the western ridges had been the color of beaten lead since first light. By breakfast, the wind was beginning to move in the tops of the ponderosa pines on the slope above the cabin, a low, restless sound like a great animal turning in its sleep. By mid-morning, the first hard flakes were rattling against the kitchen window like buckshot. Holden was already at the door, pulling on his heavy wool coat. Wesson was tightening the strap on his rifle scabbard. Briggs was lacing his boots with the speed of a young man who has learned that hesitation in the mountains can cost a brother his life. Cattle, Holden said. The 2 words were enough. Cordelia had been on the ranch for almost 3 weeks now, and she was learning to read the language these brothers spoke without speaking. The 40 head of cattle were on the upper meadow. If the storm caught them in the open, they would drift before the wind until they walked off a ridge or piled up against a fence and froze where they stood. The brothers had to drive them down into the natural stone windbreak on the lee side of the lower ridge, and they had to do it in the next 90 minutes or they would lose half the herd. What can I do? Cordelia said. She was standing at the kitchen table with a dish towel in her hands. Holden looked at her for half a second, but in that half second she saw something pass through his eyes that she had not seen there before. Or, not surprise, not refusal, something closer to gratitude. Wood, he said, as much as you can carry. Stack it inside the front room, not on the porch. Bank the fire high, heat water. Wesson cured a venison roast last week, the small one in the smokehouse. Bring it inside before the door freezes shut. And Cordelia, yes, if we are not back by dark, you bolt this door, you keep the rifle by the hearth, and you do not open it for anyone whose voice you do not know. Not for anyone, Cordelia, I understand. He held her eyes for one more moment. Then he was out the door and into the white, and Wesson was right behind him, and Briggs paused only long enough to give her a quick, boyish grin that was meant to reassure her and only partly succeeded. She did exactly what he had told her to do. She hauled wood, load after load, the smaller logs because she could not lift the larger ones, but she made up for it in trips. She stacked them along the wall by the hearth until the stack was as tall as her shoulder. She heated 3 pots of water on the iron stove. She pulled the small venison roast from the smokehouse with her hands going numb in the wet flakes, and she set it in the cast iron Dutch oven with onions and potatoes and salt and a long, slow heat. She chased the chickens into the coop, getting pecked twice on the wrist for her trouble. She slipped twice on the icy step coming back from the well, and the second time she caught herself only by grabbing the porch rail, and she stood there for a moment with her heart pounding and the wet snow already soaking through her shawl, and she laughed out loud at the sheer absurdity of being a Boston governess wrestling a woodpile in a Montana blizzard. She laughed because if she did not laugh, she was going to weep, and weeping was not a luxury this country allowed. The storm thickened. The light outside the windows went from gray to a strange luminous white to a thicker, grayer thing that was almost dusk by noon. The wind rose into a long, continuous howl in the eaves. Cordelia could not see the barn from the kitchen window. She could not see the woodpile from the porch. The world had been erased and replaced with a single blank page on which the only thing left was the small lit square of the Ashbury cabin. She fed the fire. She set the table for four. She sat down in the rocking chair with her hands folded, and she waited. She was praying again. Not the desperate clawing prayer of the road. This was a quieter prayer. This was the prayer of a woman who had only just begun to understand that the four men she was now waiting for, three living and one in heaven, who had built the chair she was sitting in, had become in some quiet, impossible way her family. "Bring them home," she whispered to the popping fire. "Please bring all three of them home." They came back at 2:15 in the afternoon. She heard the boots stamping snow off on the front porch and had the door open before the first knock. They came in one at a time, ducking under the lintel snow, crusted on their hats and the shoulders of their coats, their faces raw and red, and grinning the exhausted grins of men who had just beaten weather that wanted them dead. Holden first, then Wesson, who clapped his older brother once on the back as he came through the door, the closest thing to celebration Wesson Ashbury would ever allow himself. Then Briggs, who saw Cordelia standing in the firelight with her face full of relief, and threw both arms around her without thinking, and lifted her clean off the floor in a great frozen wet hug that smelled of pine and wood smoke and weather. And Cordelia laughed against the icy collar of his coat and said, "Put me down, you ridiculous boy. You are getting snow all over the rug." He set her down. He was already turning red around the ears. Holden was watching the whole thing from the doorway with an expression on his face that Cordelia did not quite understand. He looked away the moment her eyes found his. "The cattle," she said. "All of them," Holden said. "Behind the windbreak. We lost a heifer to a broken leg on the way down, that is all. The rest are alive." "Then come and eat," she said. They came to the table. They ate the way men eat after they have been moved by something that almost killed them. Slowly at first, then faster. Then with the grateful, focused attention of men who have remembered that they are mortal. The cabin was warm. The fire was high. The wind howled outside, but it could not get in. And Cordelia Vance sitting at the head of that table, because none of the brothers would sit there, and someone had to watch her three mountain men shovel down stew and tear chunks off the loaf of bread she had finally figured out how to bake on the second try, and she felt something settle inside her chest that she had not felt since the night her mother died. It was the feeling of being inside, not just inside walls, inside a circle, inside a place where she belonged. Wesson set down his spoon halfway through his second bowl. He looked across the table at her with those sharp green eyes. "Good stew," he said. It was the longest sentence Wesson Ashbury had spoken to her since the morning she had first walked out of the bedroom on shaking legs. Briggs nearly knocked his cup over. Holden, at the end of the table, lifted his eyes to her face and said nothing. But the look in those eyes said more than any sentence in any of her father's books had ever said. It said, "You belong here." It said, "I am glad you are here." It said, "I do not know what I am going to do about this feeling in my chest, but I know I am not going to fight it anymore." The peace of that afternoon was the last full peace they would have for a long time. 3 days after the storm cleared, Cordelia walked out to the chicken coop alone in the bright, cold morning to gather eggs. The snow was knee-deep across the yard, but Briggs had shoveled a path from the porch to the coop and from the coop to the barn. The sky was a deep, flawless blue. Her breath made small white clouds in front of her face. She was not thinking about bears. The black bear came around the corner of the woodshed 20 feet from her, drawn by the smell of the chicken feed in her apron. Cordelia froze. It was a young black bear, half-grown, more curious than dangerous. But to her eye, the animal in front of her was the size of a wagon. Her legs locked. Her hands fell open. The empty egg basket hit the snow with a small, soft thump. The bear lifted its head. It took one heavy step forward. Holden came around the corner of the barn at exactly that moment. He had been splitting kindling on the far side of the barn. He had heard the soft thump of the basket hitting the snow. He had not heard her cry out because she had not been able to cry out, and the silence of her had been worse than any scream. He had dropped his axe and come around the corner at a run, and now he saw the bear, and he saw Cordelia, and he understood the geometry of the next 10 seconds in the way a man understands the geometry when his whole heart is at stake. He did not draw the revolver on his belt. He did something stranger. He stepped between her and the bear. He raised both arms to their full enormous span, and he pulled himself up to his full height of 6 foot 5 inches, and he opened his mouth and he made a sound that came up out of him from a place deeper than his lungs. It was not a shout. It was not a roar. It was the noise the mountain itself might make if you hit it with a hammer. It came rolling out of his chest in one great wall of sound, and the young black bear took one long look at Holden Ashbury, wheeled around on his hind legs, and bolted back into the timber so fast its paws sprayed snow. The yard went silent. Holden lowered his arms slowly. He turned. Cordelia was still standing in exactly the same place. The empty basket was at her feet. Her face was the color of the snow around her boots. Her hands were trembling. She was beyond crying. She was simply looking up at him with her cornflower blue eyes wide as a child's, and her chest was rising and falling in fast, small breaths. He took 2 steps forward and put one weathered, working hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right?" She nodded. She tried to speak. No sound came out. She nodded again. He left his hand on her shoulder. The weight of it, the warmth of it, through the wool of her shawl was the only solid thing in the entire world. She lifted her own small hand and laid it over the back of his hand without thinking, without planning, without any of the careful Boston manners she had been taught from the cradle. She just laid her hand over his and held on. Their faces were inches apart. He had not meant to be standing this close. She had not meant to be looking up at him. The morning was very cold and very bright and very still, and in that stillness, Holden Ashbury looked down at the woman in front of him and felt the last frozen place in his chest break clean open. "I am all right," she said, finally finding her voice. "Because of you." He pulled his hand back as if her shoulder had burned him. He stepped back. He stepped back again. He turned away from her so that she could not see his face, and he said in a voice that was not quite steady, "Do not go out alone. Not yet. Not until I tell you it is safe." Then he walked very fast back toward the barn, and he did not look back. That night, for the first time since she had arrived at the Ashbury Ranch, Cordelia Vance lay in her bed and did not bolt the bedroom door before she blew out the lamp. The morning after the bear, Wesson Ashbury walked the perimeter of the ranch in widening circles. He found what he was looking for half a mile south of the cabin in a stand of young pines on a ridge that overlooked the trail. 2 men, not one this time. 2. The boot prints were the same narrow-heeled shape he had seen 10 days before. City boots. The cigarette stubs beside the prints were the same Eastern brand, but this time there was something new. A small brass casing in the snow, the kind that comes out of a revolver after a test fire. From this ridge with a good rifle scope, a man could see the front door of the Ashbury cabin clearly. He could see the woman in the navy blue dress when she walked out to the chicken coop. He walked back down to the cabin and gave his report to Holden in the same flat-clipped way he gave all his reports. 2 men, yesterday morning before the bear. They were in position when she walked out to the coop. They watched the whole thing. Holden's face went very still. "Get the rifle off the wall," he said. Both rifles, that same afternoon, as if the mountain itself had decided that the news could not wait one more day, Aunt Adelaide Thornberry came riding up the snow-packed road from Elkhorn on a tough little bay mare. She was 47 years old. She had her dead sister's eyes, the same cornflower blue as Cordelia's, only weathered by 20 years of frontier wind. She was Cordelia's only living relative on the entire continent. She slid down off her mare and walked across the snow without a word and pulled Cordelia into an embrace so fierce and so long that both of them had begun to weep without quite knowing why. But Adelaide Thornberry had not ridden 15 miles up a mountain road in November to embrace her niece. She had ridden up because of the letter in her coat pocket. She let Cordelia go. She wiped her face on her sleeve. She looked across the porch at Holden Ashbury, who was standing by the door of the cabin with his hat in his hands, and she said, "Mister, I am sorry to be the kind of guest who arrives with bad news, but bad news is what I have brought." She held out the letter. "This came to the post office in Elkhorn yesterday morning. It is addressed to my niece. I opened it because I am her people and because I had a feeling about it. I read it, and then I saddled my mare." Holden took the letter without looking at it. He walked into the cabin. Cordelia followed. Wesson and Briggs came in behind them. Holden set the letter on the kitchen table. He unfolded it. He read it once in silence. Then he handed it to Cordelia. The handwriting was small and precise and elegant. The paper was thick and expensive. The signature at the bottom was a single name in black ink. Cordelia. Did you think distance could hide you from me? I have employed men of considerable competence, and they have found you. I am writing to you from a hotel in the town of Elkhorn, Montana Territory. I am giving you 1 week. 1 week from the date of this letter, you will return to me of your own free will, and we will speak no more of any of this unpleasantness. If you do not, I will come to you personally, and I will bring with me certain papers and certain men, and the family of mountain ranchers who have so kindly offered you their hospitality will discover that hospitality has a price they did not know they were paying. Do not test me on this, Cordelia. You know me better than that. Yours in patience that will not last. Thaddeus Pemberton. The cabin was perfectly silent when she finished reading it. Cordelia set the letter down on the table. Her hands were not trembling. You should have told me, Holden said. His voice was very low. I know. Why did you not tell me? She lifted her eyes from the letter. Her cornflower blue eyes met his across the kitchen table. Because I was afraid that if you knew the whole shape of what I had brought to your door, you would decide the kindest thing was to send me away. Not out of cruelty, out of duty. You would have decided that the safest thing for everyone in this house was to remove the danger. And the danger is me. Holden Ashbury took 2 slow steps around the corner of the kitchen table until he was standing in front of Cordelia. He looked down at her. You are not the danger, Cordelia. I came with the danger. You came with a head, or you did not write, and a husband you did not choose, he said. And the man who wrote that letter back there, the man who is sitting in that hotel in Elkhorn right now, thinking he owns the air you breathe, that man is the danger. Not you, and nobody, not Thaddeus Pemberton, not the men he has hired, not the entire Pemberton shipping fortune is going to take you out of this house unless you tell me with your own mouth that you want to go. Do you hear me, Cordelia? With your own mouth. Nobody else's. She heard him. She could only nod. Holden looked over her head at his middle brother. Wesson, take the letter. We are going to build a watch tonight. 2 on 2 off all night, every night until this is finished. Wesson was already lifting his rifle off the peg by the door. Briggs said, Holden, tomorrow at first light you ride to Elkhorn. You go see Sheriff Caldwell Reeves. You take this letter with you. You tell him I am asking, as a man who has never asked him for a favor in 5 years, that he keep his eyes open and his powder dry. Briggs nodded once. The boyish grin was nowhere on his face. Aunt Adelaide said, Holden, I am asking you to stay the night here with us. I was already planning to stay, whether you asked me or not, said Adelaide Thornbury. Wesson Ashbury was the one who found the new sign first 3 days later in the heavy timber on the south slope. 2 more boot prints, closer to the cabin this time, only half a mile out. 2 fresh stubs of Eastern tobacco, and a single piece of evidence that turned the whole thing from a watching to a hunting. Beside one of the boot prints, half buried in the snow, was a small folded piece of paper. Wesson lifted it out of the snow with the tip of his hunting knife. He unfolded it carefully. It was a hand-drawn map, crude but accurate. The cabin, the barn, the path Cordelia took to the chicken coop. An arrow drawn in pencil pointing at her bedroom window from the south ridge, and 3 numbers written beside the arrow that any hunting man would recognize as the range in yards from the ridge to the window. Wesson Ashbury knelt in the snow with the map in his hand, and his sharp green eyes went very flat and very cold. He folded the map. He put it in his pocket. He walked back down toward the ranch with his rifle held low and ready. And on the way down, he took a route that would allow him to circle behind the south ridge himself and see if the men who had drawn the map were still there. They were. He saw them through a screen of pines from 60 yards out. 2 men, the first time he had seen them with his own eyes. One was tall and thin with a hunting rifle and the easy posture of a man who had shot at things that shoot back. The other was shorter and heavier, with a long knife on his belt and a small folding telescope in his hand. They were sitting beside a small, smokeless fire built between 2 rocks. They looked, Wesson noted, with the cold professional eye of a tracker, like men who had been paid well and were intending to earn the money. He started to back away. That was when his right boot came down on a single small dry branch hidden under the snow. The branch broke. The sound of it was very small, but the tall, thin man at the fire heard it. His head came up. His rifle came up half a second behind it. And before Wesson Ashbury could finish stepping back into the cover of the pines, the tall man had brought the rifle to his shoulder and fired into the trees at the place where the sound had come from. The first bullet took the dun gelding standing tied behind Wesson in the throat. The horse dropped before its legs even understood it was dying. The second bullet found Wesson Ashbury as he was diving for cover behind a ponderosa pine 3 feet thick. It punched through to the muscle on the left side of his rib cage, just below the heart grazed the 10th rib, and exited cleanly out his back in a small dark spray. The pain hit him about a second after the bullet did. It was a white-hot line of fire from his side to his spine. He landed hard behind the pine, the rifle clenched in his right hand, his left hand already pressing against the wound to slow the bleeding, because his body knew what to do without asking him. He did not panic. Wesson Ashbury had been hunting in these mountains since he was a boy, and one of the first things the mountain had taught him was that panic is a kind of death you do to yourself. He sighted around the trunk of the pine. He saw the muzzle flash from the second man's revolver 30 yards away. He fired twice fast at the place between the two muzzle flashes, not to kill, but to make them think twice about following. The men dove for cover. He heard them shouting at each other. He heard their boots scrabble in the snow as they retreated south. He waited. He counted to 30. They were not coming back. Not today. They had not expected to be shot back at, and now they were running. Wesson Ashbury dragged himself to his feet using the trunk of the pine. The world swam. He tore a long strip from his shirt and bound it around his middle as tight as he could pull it. The bleeding slowed. It did not stop. He looked down at the dun gelding who had been his horse for 6 years and had never once thrown him, and he laid one bloody hand for a moment on the dead animal's neck. "I am sorry, brother," he said quietly. Then he started walking down the mountain toward the cabin. He made it about 400 yards before his legs quit on him. He went down on his knees in the snow. He crawled the next 20 yards. Then he rolled onto his back, his rifle still clutched in his right hand because an Ashbury did not let go of his weapon, and he looked up at the cathedral arch of pines above him and at the strip of pure, cold blue sky between the branches, and his sharp green eyes began to close. He thought of his mother. He thought of the songs she used to sing in the kitchen. Then he heard the hoofbeats coming up the slope fast and hard, and he heard a voice he loved more than any voice in the world shouting his name. Holden was off the horse before the horse had stopped moving. He dropped beside his brother in the snow. His weathered hands flew to the bandage at Wesson's side, to the pulse point at his neck, to his face. The pulse was there, weak, too fast, but there. Wesson said, "Holden. Wesson, look at me. Open your eyes. That is an order, brother. Open your eyes." Wesson opened his eyes. "Two men," he whispered. "Southridge." They had a map. Holden was already gathering him up. He laid Wesson across the saddle of his own horse, climbed up behind him, held him with one arm and the reins with the other, and broke the horse into a hard gallop down the slope toward home. Cordelia heard the hoofbeats from the kitchen. She had been kneading bread on the work table. Her hands were white with flour. She heard the rhythm of the gallop, fast and uneven and wrong, and she knew before she had even reached the door that something terrible had come down off the mountain. She got the door open just as Holden came thundering into the yard. She saw Wesson draped across the saddle. She saw the blood dark and steady running down the white belly of the horse and dripping into the snow in a long, irregular line. She saw Holden's face, the face that had been carved out of granite for 3 weeks, the face that had not allowed itself one full, unguarded expression in 5 years. That face was the color of paper. His eyes were wild with the terror she had never seen in them before and prayed she would never see in them again. He said one word. "Cordelia." She did not need any other word. She turned back into the cabin, already shouting orders, her voice clear and steady and ringing through the small rooms in a tone none of them had ever heard her use. "Briggs, the kitchen, 3 pots of water on the stove right now. The biggest pots. Holden, bring him in, lay him on the kitchen table, not the bed. The table is flat, and I need flat. I need every clean cloth in this house torn into long strips. I need the whiskey from the cupboard. Not for him to drink. For the wound. Move, all of you, move." They moved. They moved because the small woman from Boston, who could not saddle a horse 3 weeks ago, had just become the only person in the entire territory of Montana who knew how to keep Wesson Ashbury from bleeding to death on his own kitchen table. And they moved because the certainty in her voice was the kind of certainty that men follow into burning buildings and into freezing rivers and into any other place a brother needs them to go. Holden carried Wesson into the cabin and laid him on the long pine table. Briggs had 3 pots of water on the stove inside of 2 minutes. Adelaide Thornberry, who had been sitting by the fire with her knitting, had the cabinet open and the whiskey bottle out before Cordelia had finished her sentence. Cordelia rolled up the sleeves of her dress to her elbows. She washed her hands in the basin with hot water and a hard yellow bar of lye soap until her wrists were red. She turned to the table. She bent over Wesson Ashbury's still face. She laid 2 fingers against the pulse point at his throat. She closed her eyes for 1 second, listening to that pulse, and then she opened her eyes and met Holden's across the table, and she gave him the only truth that mattered. "He is going to live," she said. "If you trust me for the next 3 days, your brother is going to live." Holden Ashbury, who had never in his entire life trusted any human being, completely looked across the kitchen table at the small, honey-haired woman with flowers still on her wrists and his brother's life in her hands, and he gave her the only answer he had left in him. "I trust you, Cordelia, with everything. Tell me what to do." What followed was the longest 3 days of Holden Ashbury's life. Cordelia worked. She worked the way a woman works when she has read every medical text in the library of a wealthy Boston family during 3 years of long, lonely evenings when there was nothing else in the house worth reading. She had not known sitting in that vast, quiet library with a copy of Dr. Gray's Anatomy open on her lap that the knowledge would one day come to anything. She had read it because the medical books were the only books in that house that no one else had touched. She had read it because reading anything was better than thinking about Thaddeus Pemberton at the head of the table. She had read it because her mother had once told her that knowledge of any kind was the only thing in this world that could not be taken from you. Now in a cabin on a mountain 4,000 miles from Boston, with a man's life on her kitchen table, the knowledge stepped forward and asked her what she needed it to do. She examined the wound first. Her small fingers moved over the entry point on the left side of his ribs and then around to the exit point in his back, pressing gently, feeling for the things she had read about and prayed she would never need to find. The bullet had passed clean through. There was no projectile lodged inside him. She listened to his breathing. She put her ear against the bare skin of his chest just below his heart, and she listened, and there was no rasping, no bubbling, no whistling. The lung was intact. She watched the color of the blood coming out of the wound. It was dark, not bright. It was flowing, not spurting. Muscle wound, not arterial. "He is going to live," she said again, and this time she said it as much for herself as for Holden. She cleaned the wound with boiled water that Briggs had cooled to the right temperature with snow scooped from the porch. She irrigated the entry hole and then the exit hole with the patient, steady attention of a woman who understood exactly why she was doing what she was doing. Then she reached for the whiskey bottle. She poured a generous splash directly onto the open wound. Wesson Ashbury, half conscious and floating in some place between this world and the next, snarled with pain. His eyes did not open, but his mouth moved, and the words that came out were so weak and so dry they were almost a joke. "That was good whiskey." Cordelia did not look up from her work. "And now it is saving your life," she said. "So, hold still and be quiet." Briggs, standing in the doorway of the kitchen with a fresh pot of boiling water in his hands, bit down on the inside of his cheek to keep from making any sound at all. Holden on the other side of the table made a noise in the back of his throat that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. She packed the wound with clean cloth. She bound the cloth in place with the long strips of torn bedsheet that Adelaide Thornberry had been preparing all afternoon. She elevated his feet on a folded blanket. She covered him with the patchwork quilt that his mother had sewn years ago, the same quilt she herself had been lying under 3 weeks before when Holden Ashbury had carried her into this house. The circle of it almost stopped her breath. The first night was the worst. The fever came up in him fast, the way fevers come in men who have lost blood, and his skin began to burn through the quilt, and his lips cracked and dried, and his green eyes rolled behind his closed lids. Cordelia did not leave him. She sat on a wooden stool beside the kitchen table where Holden had lain him out, and she changed the cool cloths on his forehead every 12 minutes by the small mantel clock on the shelf, and she dribbled small amounts of cold water between his lips when he was conscious enough to swallow. Holden sat on the other side of the table. He did not speak. He did not move except to feed the fire when it burned low. He just watched her work. He watched the small, precise way her hands moved. He watched her wipe the sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist when she did not have a clean hand. He watched the way she would lean forward every few minutes to listen to his brother's breathing and the way her shoulders would relax by the smallest fraction when she heard what she needed to hear. He watched her and he understood somewhere very deep inside himself that he was watching the most extraordinary woman he had ever known in his life and that he was probably never going to see anything that mattered to him more than this. In the deep, cold hours of 3 in the morning, when the fire had burned down to red coals and the wind on the mountain had finally fallen still, and the cabin was as quiet as the inside of a church, Wesson Ashbury came up out of the fever just enough to know that someone was holding his hand. His green eyes opened. They did not focus. They saw only a small, honey-colored shape in the lamplight beside him. His grip tightened weakly around her fingers. His voice was so small that even Cordelia, leaning close, could barely hear it. "Mother," he whispered. The word went into her like a knife. She did not pull her hand back. She did not correct him. She did not try to explain to a half-conscious man with a bullet wound in his side that his mother had been dead for 5 winters. Instead, Cordelia Vance, the bookseller's daughter from Boston, did the only thing the mother she had loved would have wanted her to do. She tightened her own fingers around the tracker's calloused hand. She bent her head down close to his ear, and in a low, quiet voice, the same low, quiet voice her own mother had used to her when she had been a small, frightened child unable to sleep in her bed, she began to sing. It was an old lullaby, a song about the moon and the sea and a house that was always waiting with a light in the window. She did not know if Wesson could hear the words. She only knew that the singing of them was the right thing to do and that some things are right whether anyone hears them or not. Across the table, Holden Ashbury watched his brother's face soften in the lamplight. He watched the white pain go out of the lines around the closed eyes. He watched the fever break across the green leaves of those eyelids, the way a wave breaks on a shore. And then he watched his brother's grip on Cordelia's small hand finally relax into the deep, clean sleep of a man who has decided for reasons he himself does not fully understand that he is going to stay in this world a little longer. Holden Ashbury, who had not wept in front of another human being since the morning he buried his mother, lifted his big calloused hand to his face and pressed it against his eyes and wept silently across the kitchen table while the woman he loved sang a song to his brother in the small, dark hours. The fever broke for good just before noon on the 3rd day. Wesson opened his eyes. They were clear. They were focused. They found Cordelia first slumped in the wooden chair beside the table, her honey blonde hair fallen out of its pins and her cheek resting on her own folded arm and her small hand still loosely curled around his. He did not wake her. He looked at her for a long time. Then his green eyes moved to his older brother on the other side of the table, and the 2 Ashbury men looked at each other across a kitchen table in a cabin on a mountain, and a great deal of what needed to be said between them passed without a single word. Then Wesson cleared his throat, just once, quietly. Cordelia's head came up, her eyes still half closed with exhaustion. She saw his face. She saw his eyes. And the smile that broke across her own face was the most beautiful thing Holden Ashbury had ever seen in his life. "Welcome back," she whispered. Wesson worked his dry mouth. 2 words came out, each one slow and careful. "Thank you." Then a 3rd word, almost as an afterthought, in the flat-clipped voice of the tracker she had come to know. 2 men. Rifles. City boots. That evening, when Wesson had been moved carefully from the kitchen table into Holden's old bed and was sleeping the deep, clean sleep of a man whose body has been given permission to mend, the 4 of them gathered in the front room around the dying light of the fire. Briggs had ridden to Elkhorn and back already in the gray hour just after dawn, and the news he brought home was not the kind of news that lets a man sleep easy. Sheriff Caldwell Reeves had already had 2 visitors that morning. The first had been a man named Thaddeus Pemberton, lately of Boston, currently lodged at the Elkhorn Hotel under his own name. The second had been Pemberton's lawyer, who had brought with him certain papers and certain documents and a very long conversation about a young woman named Cordelia Vance, who was the lawyer claimed mentally unwell and in need of being returned to the care of her family back east. Sheriff Reeves had listened politely. He had said nothing. He had then walked to the window of his office and watched the lawyer walk back down the street to the hotel, and he had spat carefully into the brass spittoon beside his desk. "He believes you," Briggs said quietly to Cordelia. "Reeves does. He told me so. He just cannot move on a Boston man with papers and a lawyer until that man does something that crosses a line he can prove." Cordelia nodded. She was sitting in the rocking chair beside the fire. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face was very tired, the kind of tired that goes deeper than sleep can reach, but her eyes were steady. Then we have a problem that the law cannot solve, she said. So we will solve it ourselves. Holden was standing by the window with his back to the room looking out at the dark slope of the mountain. He did not turn around when he spoke. Cordelia. Yes. He turned. He walked across the room until he was standing in front of her. He looked down at her. The firelight was on his face, and his eyes were not the eyes of the granite man she had first met in this room 3 weeks ago. They were the eyes of a man who had been watching her hold his brother's hand through a fever night and had finally understood the thing he had been trying not to understand. He went down on one knee in front of the rocking chair. Briggs in the doorway of the kitchen made a small sound and clapped one hand over his own mouth. Holden ignored him. He took both of Cordelia's small hands in his weathered working hands. He held them very gently the way a man holds something he has spent his entire life trying not to break. I prayed for someone, he said. Yes. I prayed for someone and you came. I have spent 20 days trying to tell myself that what I felt about that was something else. Gratitude. Responsibility. The duty a man owes to a stranger that God put in his path. But I am not going to lie to you tonight, Cordelia, because tonight my brother is alive in that bed because of you, and I do not have any lies left in me. She was very still. She was barely breathing. I love you, said Holden Ashbury. I love you the way a man loves the only good thing that has ever happened to him in his entire life. I am too old and too rough and too poor to be what you should have. I have nothing to offer you except this cabin, these two brothers, this mountain, and every breath I have left in my body. But if you will have me, Cordelia Vance, those are yours. All of them. Forever. And not for any price. Never for any price. The fire popped softly. Outside the window, the wind on the mountain had gone perfectly still, the way it sometimes goes still when it knows it is being asked to listen. Cordelia did not answer with words. She lifted her own small hands free of his, and she laid both of her palms flat against the rough stubble of his jaw, and she leaned forward in the rocking chair until her forehead was pressed against his forehead, and she stayed there for a long moment with her eyes closed. Then she said very quietly the only thing she had ever needed to say to him. Yes. Yes, Holden. Yes. He kissed her then, once, briefly, with a tenderness that did not match the size of his hands at all. The kiss tasted of cold mountain air and the strong black coffee he had been living on for 3 days, and Cordelia would remember the taste of it exactly on the day she was an old woman sitting on this same porch watching her grandchildren chase each other through the wildflowers. In the doorway of that kitchen, Briggs Ashbury was openly weeping. He was not even trying to hide it. His mother's son to the bone, the youngest brother, who had set this whole impossible thing in motion 6 weeks ago by writing a letter in the back room of the Elkhorn post office, was sobbing with a wide-open joy that had no place else to go. Behind him in the bedroom down the hall, Wesson Ashbury was deep asleep and slowly mending, and on his face there was the smallest possible smile, as if even in the depths of his sleep, his sharp green eyes had seen something through the cracked door of the bedroom that pleased him very much. 3 days later, Cordelia rode out from the cabin alone on a mild gray morning, heading down the mountain road toward Aunt Adelaide's place in Elkhorn. She had a wedding dress to fetch. Adelaide had promised her one, an old dress that had been her own mother's, kept all these years in a cedar chest, and Cordelia wanted to ride down and see it and try it on and hold it up against herself in front of her aunt's mirror, the way a woman is supposed to. Holden had not wanted her to go alone. Holden had wanted to ride with her every step. But Wesson was still recovering, and Briggs had to stay and watch the perimeter, and Cordelia had laughed gently and told her tall mountain man that the road to her aunt's house was the most traveled road in the valley and that she would be back by supper. She had kissed him on the cheek before she rode out. He had stood in the yard and watched her until the bend in the trail took her out of sight, and then he had stood there for another minute looking at the place where she had been. She never reached her aunt's house. 3 miles down the road where the trail dropped through a steep stand of timber, 2 riders came out of the trees on either side of her at the same instant. They had been waiting since before dawn. The tall, thin one took her reins. The shorter, heavier one came up alongside and gripped her arm above the elbow. They did not strike her. They did not draw a weapon. They were professional men paid by a wealthy employer, and they had been instructed very clearly that the woman was to be delivered without a mark on her. "You will come with us quietly, ma'am," said the tall, thin one, "and no harm will come to you. Mr. Pemberton just wants to talk." Cordelia did not scream. She did not weep. She looked at each of them in turn with her cornflower blue eyes very steady, and she committed both of their faces to memory, the way Wesson Ashbury had taught her to commit a set of bear tracks to memory. And she said one sentence very quietly, more to herself than to either of them. "You should not have done this. You should not have come up onto this mountain." Then she let them lead her horse off the road and down a side trail that climbed up into the timber. And the only sound left on the empty road after they were gone was the lonely call of a hawk circling somewhere very high up against the gray ski. Adelaide Thornberry was the one who realized something was wrong. Cordelia had said she would be at the house by mid-morning. By 11, the sun had climbed and there was no sign of her. By 11:30, Adelaide had her own bay mare saddled. By noon, she was riding hard up the mountain road herself, her gray hair blown out behind her, her cornflower blue eyes scanning every cut in the trees on either side of the trail. She found Holden in the yard splitting kindling. The axe was halfway through its swing when she rode in. She did not have to say anything. He saw her face and the axe came down on the chopping block, and he was running before she had even slid out of the saddle. "She never came," said Adelaide Thornberry. "She never reached me. I rode the road myself. There is sign of 2 horses leaving the road 3 miles down." They went up into the timber on the south side. Holden Ashbury stood in the yard for exactly 3 seconds. To Briggs, who had come out of the barn at a run and was now standing white-faced beside the corral, those 3 seconds were the most frightening thing he had ever seen in his entire life. Because in those 3 seconds, the light in his older brother's eyes simply went out. Not dimmed, not flickered. Went out the way a lamp goes out when you turn the wick all the way down. And what came in to replace it was not the blank shock of grief. It was something else. It was the focused, absolute calm of a man who has just realized that there is now only one thing left in the entire world that matters, and that he has nothing left to lose by giving everything he has to it. "We ride," said Holden Ashbury. Now, Wesson came out of the cabin door at that moment. He should not have been on his feet. He should still have been in bed. He had pulled his coat on over his bandages, and his rifle was in his right hand, and his face, despite the weakness in his legs, was as sharp and as clear as a hawk's. "You are not going alone, brother. You are wounded. I am wounded. I am not dead, and I am the only tracker on this mountain who can read those prints." There was no argument to be had. Holden looked at his middle brother for half a second and then nodded once, and then the 3 Ashbury brothers were saddling horses faster than 3 men have ever saddled horses on the Bitterroot slope, and Adelaide Thornberry was already sweeping into the cabin to tend the fire and wait, because waiting was the hardest thing, and somebody had to do it. They rode hard down the mountain road. Wesson was up on the dappled gray that Briggs usually rode because the dun gelding was dead in the timber, and Wesson would not ride any other horse close to the kill. Briggs had taken the big plow horse, the slow one, because everything else was either Wesson's or Holden's. Holden himself rode his own bay stallion, the one he had broken 3 years ago, the only horse on the place that could outrun a strong wind. They reached the place where the tracks left the road in less than 30 minutes. Wesson swung down from the saddle despite the wound in his side that was starting to bleed again through the bandages. He bent over the prints in the soft earth. His green eyes moved across the ground the way another man's eyes might move across a printed page. After a moment, he straightened and pointed up into the timber. 2 men, 1 woman. Her horse is between theirs, controlled. She is alive. She is not bound. The print is too even for that. They are taking her up to the old prospector's cabin on Granite Creek. There is nowhere else up that draw with a roof. "How far?" said Holden. 40 minutes hard riding. We can be there before they finish whatever Pemberton is planning to say to her." They went up into the timber. The old prospector's cabin sat in a small clearing on the bank of Granite Creek, 2 miles off the main trail. The roof was sound, but the windows had been broken out years ago and replaced with oilcloth. There was smoke coming from the stone chimney when the Ashbury brothers reached the edge of the clearing, on foot, having tied the horses 50 yards back in the trees. 2 saddled horses were tied to the porch rail. A 3rd horse, Cordelia's, was tied to the side of the cabin. Inside, Cordelia Vance was sitting on a small wooden crate in the middle of the dusty room, with her hands folded in her lap, watching the man across from her drink tea. The tea was real tea in a real china cup, brought all the way from Boston in a velvet-lined wooden case that now sat open on the rough wooden table beside him. Thaddeus Pemberton was wearing a black wool overcoat and a starched white collar in polished leather boots. He had set the cup down on its saucer with the same precise, unhurried motion he used to set down a glass at his club on Beacon Hill. He had crossed one leg over the other. The whole performance, Cordelia understood, was a kind of speech he was making to himself. A speech that said, "Look at me, Thaddeus Pemberton. I am still in control. Look at the china cup. Look at the polished boots. Look at how nothing about this dirty little cabin has touched me. I am the same man I was in Boston. I am still the man I have always been." She watched him with her cornflower blue eyes, very calm. "Cordelia," he said, "you look thinner. The frontier does not become you." "You came a very long way to tell me I look thin," she said. He smiled. The smile did not reach his gray eyes. "I came a very long way because no one walks out of my life until I say so. I told you that in the library on the night you broke our engagement. I do not believe you really thought I was joking." "I never thought you were joking," she said. "I just thought you would have more dignity than to come." The smile flickered just slightly. He set the saucer down on the table beside the velvet case. "Dignity," he said, "is a virtue of the man who has won. I will have my dignity again as soon as you are sitting in a private compartment on a train back east. I will dress you in silk on the day of our wedding. I will give you children. I will give you a name that opens every door in Boston. And in 20 years, we will both look back on this little episode, and we will laugh the way one laughs at a child who once threw a tantrum." Cordelia did not laugh. Cordelia leaned forward slightly in her seat, and she looked at him across the dusty cabin, and she said the truest thing she had ever said in her entire life. "Do you know what makes you different from Holden Ashbury, Thaddeus?" He did not answer. "Holden is taller than you," she said. "Holden is stronger than you. Holden could break you in half if he wanted to. But that is not the difference. The difference is this. When Holden Ashbury looks at me, he sees a person. When you look at me, you have only ever seen a thing you wanted, a thing you bought with kindness and clothes and an education in the hope that someday it would owe you back. I spent 3 years in your father's house being a thing. I will not spend the rest of my life being one." The Polish cracked. It cracked just for an instant. Behind the gray eyes, she saw something move that was not anger and was not arrogance. It was a small, terrible bewilderment. The bewilderment of a man who had been taught from the cradle that loving someone meant providing for them and now did not understand why providing for someone had not made him loved. "I gave you everything," said Thaddeus Pemberton, and his voice for the first time was not entirely steady. "A home, safety, a future. I gave you my name. What more did you want?" And in that one cracked sentence, Cordelia Vance understood the man in front of her more completely than she had understood him in 3 years of living in his father's house. Thaddeus Pemberton was not evil. He was empty. He had been raised by men who had taught him that love was a ledger, and now he genuinely could not understand why the ledger had not balanced. For one strange small moment, sitting on the wooden crate with her hands folded in her lap, Cordelia felt something very close to pity. "You gave me everything," she said softly, "except the only thing that ever mattered. You never once asked me what I wanted." His mouth opened. He searched for an answer. That was the moment the door of the cabin exploded inward. Holden Ashbury came through the doorway, like the mountain itself, walking into the room. He filled the frame from one side to the other. There was snow on his shoulders and frost in his beard, and the shotgun his father had owned was cradled across his forearms, and his eyes had the color of molten copper, and they were fixed entirely on Thaddeus Pemberton, and there was no expression on his face at all. And the lack of expression was the most terrifying thing Thaddeus Pemberton had ever seen in his life. Behind Holden, framed in the doorway, the 2 hired men on the porch had already made their professional calculation. One Ashbury at the front door with a shotgun, a second Ashbury at the back of the cabin. They could feel him there, even though they could not see him, the unmistakable presence of a tracker with a rifle covering the only other exit, and somewhere up in the timber, almost certainly a third one watching the windows. They were paid men. They were not stupid men. They set their weapons down on the floorboards of the porch and put their hands behind their heads, and Briggs Ashbury came around the corner of the cabin and tied them with rope as politely as if he were tying up a calf. Inside, Holden took 2 long steps across the dusty floor and lifted Thaddeus Pemberton off his crate by the front of his immaculate Boston coat. The lift was effortless. Thaddeus Pemberton weighed perhaps 170 pounds, and Holden Ashbury lifted him as if he weighed nothing at all. The china cup tipped off the table and shattered on the dirt floor. Holden held him up against the rough log wall of the cabin. Their faces were inches apart. Thaddeus Pemberton's polished gray eyes met Holden Ashbury's molten copper ones, and Thaddeus Pemberton, for the first time in his pampered, Harvard-educated life, understood with absolute physical clarity what it meant to be powerless. Not the inconvenient powerlessness of a business reverse. The bone-deep, body-freezing powerlessness of a man who is being held against a wall by another man who could end him with one motion and is choosing second by second not to. "You sent men to shoot my brother," Holden said quietly. Thaddeus could not speak. "You hired men to take her off the road like she was a piece of livestock." Thaddeus could not speak. "I am going to do something now that you do not deserve," said Holden Ashbury. "I am going to let you live, and I am going to let you live because the woman who is sitting behind me on that crate is the kind of woman who would ask me to. She is going to ask me in about 10 seconds because she is a better person than I am, and I am going to listen to her because that is what a man does when he loves a woman as much as I love her. Do you understand me, Pemberton?" Thaddeus made a small sound. It was not a word. Holden said Cordelia behind him. She had not raised her voice. She had not even stood up from the crate. She had just spoken his name exactly the way he had known she would. "Holden," she said again. "Put him down. Let the law have him." Holden Ashbury held Thaddeus Pemberton against the wall for one more breath. Then he set him down very carefully the way a man sets down something that is not worth breaking. Sheriff Reeves came up the trail with Adelaide Thornberry and 3 deputies a little less than an hour later. Adelaide had ridden straight to Elkhorn the moment the Ashbury brothers had ridden out, and Sheriff Reeves had not needed convincing twice. The 2 hired men were taken in restraints. Thaddeus Pemberton was taken in restraints. The lawyer who had been waiting in the hotel in Elkhorn would be taken in restraints by sundown. There would be a trial in the spring, and Thaddeus Pemberton would be convicted of kidnapping and conspiracy, and he would serve 7 years in a federal prison in Yuma, Arizona. And on the morning of his release, he would step out into the desert sun and stand for a long time looking at the empty horizon, and a thing inside him that had been cracked for many years would finally quietly finish breaking. He would not return to Boston. He would not return to Montana. He would die alone in his middle 50s in a small adobe house in New Mexico with a single book of poetry on the nightstand beside him, a book he had bought for himself in his 40th year, because he had finally very late begun to wonder what the people who read poetry knew about the world that he did not. But that is a story for another evening. On the afternoon, they brought Cordelia Vance back down the mountain to the Ashbury cabin. Holden carried her the last 100 yards from the road to the front porch in his arms, even though her legs were perfectly fine, and she protested the whole way and laughed at him through her tears, and Briggs ran ahead to open the front door, and Wesson was leaning against the door frame waiting for them with his green eyes very bright and the smallest smile in the world on his careful mouth, and the 4 of them came in out of the cold and shut the door behind them, and the cabin on the slope of the Bitterroot Mountains was for the first time in 5 long years exactly the thing it had been built to be: a home. They were married on a cold, bright morning in late December in the small white church in Elkhorn. The pot-bellied stove in the corner of the church had been stoked for 2 hours before the ceremony to take the worst of the chill off the air. The plain glass windows let in clean white winter light. There were perhaps 30 people in the pews, most of them ranching families from the surrounding valleys who had ridden 2 or 3 hours to be there, because the news of the Ashbury wedding had moved through that country the way news always moves through frontier country, by mouth slowly with great care for the details. Aunt Adelaide Thornberry and her husband Mercer stood as witnesses. Mercer, who had said perhaps 4 sentences to Holden in their entire acquaintance, shook his hand before the ceremony and said, "You take care of that girl," and the words were not a request but a condition. Holden met his eyes and nodded once. Wesson stood beside Holden at the altar. He was still recovering from the wound, and he stood a little stiffly, and his green eyes had the slightly faraway look of a man who had been very close to dying very recently and had not yet finished thinking about what it had felt like. But Wesson Ashbury was smiling. Not the small, careful flicker that passed for a smile in his daily life. A real smile. The kind that reaches the eyes and stays there. The kind that the people of Elkhorn had not seen on the face of Wesson Ashbury since the winter his parents had died 5 years ago. Briggs held the wedding ring. It was a simple gold band that the three brothers had pooled their money to buy from the jeweler in Elkhorn, who normally dealt in silver mining supplies, and had to send all the way to Helena to get a proper ring on short notice. Briggs cried through the entire ceremony. He could not help it. He had set this whole impossible thing in motion 6 weeks ago by walking into the post office with an envelope in his coat pocket, and now he was standing in a church watching his older brother promise his life to the woman who had crossed half a continent because of that envelope. And Briggs Ashbury simply could not contain the joy of it. And so he wept openly, and the women in the pews passed handkerchiefs down the rows without being asked. Cordelia wore a white dress that Adelaide had helped her sew. Simple, practical, beautiful in the way honest things are beautiful. Her honey blonde hair was pinned up with a single dried sprig of wildflower that Wesson had pressed between the pages of a book 6 weeks earlier without telling anyone what it was for, and had brought out of his coat pocket on the morning of the wedding without ceremony and laid in her hands. Holden wore his only suit. It had been bought 5 years ago for his parents' funeral, and he had not expected to need it again for anything joyful. The fabric was a little tight across the shoulders now, because 5 years of ranch work had made him broader than he had been at 23. But to Cordelia, looking up at him across the small church, he was the most magnificent thing she had ever seen. Not because of the suit, but because of the eyes. Those whiskey-colored eyes that she had first seen through the fog of fever that had watched over her through 3 days of sickness, that had burned with cold fury when Thaddeus Pemberton spoke her name in the dusty cabin, and that were now looking down at her with an open, undefended tenderness she had not known a human face was capable of holding. When Holden slid the small gold band onto her finger and bent down to kiss her, as his wife, something fundamental shifted inside him. A small piece he had not known was missing clicked quietly into place. A man keeps his word, his father had told him once. And Holden Ashbury, who had spent 5 lonely years keeping every word he ever made to himself, had finally found a word worth saying out loud to another person. I do. The wedding breakfast was held at the Crawford Ranch. There were tables set up under the cottonwoods. There was venison and elk and fresh bread and a great kettle of stew. Mr. Donnelly, the blacksmith, was there with his red-haired daughter, Maribel, and Briggs Ashbury spent the entire afternoon trying very hard not to look at her and failing at it constantly, and Cordelia, watching from the head table on her husband's arm, made a small private note of it that she would tease Briggs about later. After the meal, when the long blue twilight was beginning to come down across the meadow, and the lamps were being lit, and the children were beginning to grow tired and curl up against their mothers in the soft grass, Briggs Ashbury brought out the violin. It had been his father's, a battered old instrument with a crack along the neck that their father had repaired with glue and a strip of rawhide. It had not been played since the night before their father had died. Briggs drew the bow slowly across the strings, and the first notes of a Scottish folk song lifted into the cooling evening air. It was a melody their mother had sung in the kitchen on winter nights, when the world outside was frozen and the world inside was warm. Holden looked at Cordelia. Cordelia looked at Holden. And then in front of all those people, the eldest Ashbury brother, who had never danced once in his entire life, held out his weathered working hand to the bookseller's daughter from Boston, and she took it, and he led her out into the open space in front of the cottonwoods, and they began very awkwardly, very tenderly to dance. He counted under his breath. He stepped on her toes twice. He held her as if she were made of glass. None of it mattered. They were the only 2 people on earth. That was the moment Wesson Ashbury laughed. It came from where he had been sitting on a hay bale at the edge of the dancing space with a tin cup of cider in his hand, watching his older brother attempt to waltz. It was not a chuckle. It was not a snort. It was a laugh. A full, deep, unguarded laugh that came up out of a place inside Wesson Ashbury that had been sealed shut for 5 long winters. The sound of it stopped the violin. The sound of it stopped the dancing. Every head at the wedding turned toward the quietest man in the Bitterroot Valley, who was sitting on a hay bale laughing as if he had just remembered how. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. Every person in that gathering who had known the Ashbury brothers for the last 5 years understood exactly what that sound meant. Wesson Ashbury, who had buried his mother and his father 2 weeks apart, and who had not produced a single laugh out loud since that winter, was laughing again, and the long, slow healing that none of them had been sure would ever come had finally come, and it had come because of a small, honey-haired woman from Boston who had walked 4,000 miles into their lives and become against every reasonable expectation the answer to a prayer that an older brother had once shouted at the sky in the dust of his own yard. After a long moment, Briggs lifted the bow back to the violin. The song picked up again. Holden and Cordelia began slowly to dance again. And the wedding went on into the evening, and the lamps came on, and the stars came out. And somewhere in all of that, the cabin on the slope of the Bitterroot Mountains stopped being a place where three men ate and slept and worked and waited for nothing in particular and started being a home. Holden carried his new wife across the threshold of that home a little after midnight. He set her down very gently in the front room in the firelight, in the place she belonged. The bedroom door closed softly behind them. And when morning came, everything between them had changed, and the long, lonely silence that had lived in the rafters of the Ashbury cabin for 5 winters was finally and forever gone. Now I want to take you forward, friend. I want to take you forward through the years, because the best part of a story like this is never the proposal or the wedding. The best part is the part that comes after the part that lasts. The part that proves the love was real. The first child was a boy. He was born on a clear, cold morning in October of 1879, a little less than a year after the wedding, almost exactly 1 year to the day, from the night Holden Ashbury had stood in the yard and shouted 3 words at the sky. They named him Whitman after a poet whose work Cordelia's mother had loved. He had Holden's whiskey-colored eyes and Cordelia's stubborn chin and Wesson's quiet, patient watching way of looking at the world. And from the first hour he was held in his father's enormous, calloused hands. The cabin on the mountain had a new kind of sound in it. The summer of 1880 came hard. There was no rain from the middle of May to the first week of August. The creeks ran low. The grass on the upper meadow turned the color of old paper. And Holden Ashbury, faced with the possibility of losing the cattle and the herd and the land he had built his whole adult life around, did the thing he had always done before Cordelia. He shut down. He worked from before dawn until after dark. He skipped meals. He answered her questions in single syllables. He retreated very slowly and very quietly into the lonely fortress he had built around himself in the years before she came. She let him do it for 3 days. On the 4th night, after Whitman was finally asleep in his cradle and the lamp was burning low in the front room, she walked out onto the porch where Holden was sitting with his head in his hands, and she sat down in the rocking chair beside him. "You are pushing me out," she said very quietly. He did not answer. "You are going back to being the man who fired his gun at the sky, Holden Ashbury, the man who carried everything alone. But you are not alone anymore. You have me. You have a son. And I did not walk 4,000 miles to sit in a cabin watching you suffer in silence. So you are going to tell me right now what is in your head, and we are going to figure out together what to do about it." He did not look up at her for a long time. Then very slowly he did. His whiskey-colored eyes were tired in a way she had not seen before. "I do not know how to ask for help, Cordelia." "I know," she said. "So I am going to teach you. Tonight. Right here on this porch. Start with the herd. Tell me about the herd." He started with the herd. He talked for an hour. She listened. She asked questions in the careful, patient way her father had taught her to ask questions in the bookshop. By the end of the hour, they had a plan. It was not a perfect plan. Frontier ranching does not allow for perfect plans. But it was a plan that 2 people had built together instead of one man carrying it alone. And the difference was the only difference that mattered. The rain came in the 2nd week of August, slow and steady and gentle, the kind of rain a country prays for. The herd survived. The land survived. And Holden Ashbury, lying in bed beside his wife on the night the rain finally came, said into the dark, "You saved this place, Cordelia." And she said, "No, my love. We saved it. And the difference is the only difference that matters." Wesson Ashbury never married. Cordelia asked him about it once gently on a porch in the early summer of 1883, when little Evangeline was a year old and crawling on the boards at their feet. Wesson took a long time to answer. He carved a small piece off a block of pine with his knife, and he watched the curl fall away into the grass. And then he said in his usual brief way, "I have a family. I have this mountain. I have wood to carve. Some men need less than that, Cordelia. I am one of them." She nodded. She understood. Not everyone needed to find their wholeness in another person. Some people found it in a brother, in a niece, in the quiet practice of a craft that did not require words. Wesson became over the years the most beloved uncle on the Bitterroot Slope. He taught Whitman to track. He taught Evangeline to read the woods. He taught Thatcher, when the third child arrived in 1888, how to whittle a small horse out of a single block of pine. Every child who came up in the Ashbury cabin knew that Uncle Wesson's corner of the porch was the safest place in the world, and that if you sat there long enough without talking, sometimes Uncle Wesson would tell you a story that nobody else in your family had ever heard. Briggs Ashbury married Maribel Donnelly, the red-haired blacksmith's daughter, in the autumn of 1885. He cried through the whole ceremony the same way he had cried through Holden's, and the people in the pews of the same little white church in Elkhorn passed handkerchiefs down the rows, without being asked, the way they had learned to do at the first Ashbury wedding. Briggs and Maribel built a second house on the mountain 100 yards from the first, and for the first time in the history of the Ashbury Slope, there were 2 windows lit at night against the dark, and the loneliness that had once lived in the rafters of the original cabin was now down to half its size and getting smaller every year. Cordelia opened a small school. It met twice a week in the front room of the cabin. Children rode in from the surrounding ranches because the nearest proper schoolhouse was 15 miles down the mountain in Elkhorn and was too far for daily lessons. Parents paid in kind in venison and butter and eggs and the most valuable currency on the frontier, which was labor. Neighbors came up to help fix fences and dig a deeper well and put up a storage shed. In the small isolated kingdom that the Ashbury brothers had once built in defiance of the world began very slowly to belong to a community. The community had been built by the woman from Boston who had walked into it carrying nothing but a small carpet bag and a letter, and who had spent the rest of her life weaving the threads of it together with her own small, clever hands. The years went by. They went by the way good years always go, slowly while you are inside them, and very fast when you look back. There were hard winters. There were the deaths of neighbors and the births of children and the passage of seasons across the high meadows. There was a morning in the spring of 1891 when a letter arrived in Elkhorn for Cordelia Ashbury from a lawyer in Boston, informing her that the small estate her parents had left when they died of fever 12 years earlier had been carefully invested by the lawyer who had handled it on her behalf, and that the proceeds, modest but real, were now hers to do with as she wished. She read the letter twice. She walked out into the yard where her husband was repairing a fence in the long evening light. She handed him the letter. He read it. He looked up at her. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. She said, "I want to build a real schoolhouse, with a slate board, with a stove, with windows that face east so the morning light comes in." He smiled. The smile was not a rare thing on his face anymore. He had been smiling for 13 years now, and the smiles came easy to him, and they came especially easy when his wife was the one giving him a thing to think about. "Then we will build it," he said, "with our own hands, the way we have built everything else." They built it in the summer of 1891. Holden cut the logs himself. Wesson and Briggs raised the walls. Cordelia carried the small, white-painted slate board up the mountain road in the back of the wagon herself, with Whitman riding beside her holding it steady, and Evangeline and Thatcher riding behind them in the wagon bed, singing a song they had made up about a goose. The schoolhouse stood for many decades. Children of the children of the children of the first students learned their letters in that room. Now I want to take you forward one last time, friend. It was the autumn of 1900, October, 22 years to the month from the night Holden Ashbury had stood in the yard of his cabin and shouted at the sky. Holden was 50 years old. Cordelia was 44. Their hair had begun to silver at the temples. The lines around their eyes had deepened in the way that happens when two people have spent 22 years smiling at each other across a long pine table. They had 3 children. Whitman was 21 and ran most of the upper meadow herd himself. Evangeline was 17 and was preparing to leave for nursing school in San Francisco. Thatcher was 12 and was welled and joyful and reminded everyone who had ever known him of his Uncle Briggs. Briggs and Maribel had 3 more children of their own in the second house on the mountain. The Ashbury Slope had 3 lit windows at night now instead of 1, and on cold winter evenings the smoke from 3 chimneys rose straight up into the same star-washed sky. Holden and Cordelia were sitting on the porch in the 2 rocking chairs that faced west. They had been sitting in those same two chairs on that same porch at every clear evening for 22 years. The chairs had taken on the shape of their bodies. Their hands found each other across the small space between the chairs without either one of them having to look. "Tell me what you are thinking," Cordelia said softly. "I am thinking," said Holden Ashbury, "that 22 years ago tonight, I stood in this same yard and asked God to send me someone. And I am thinking that I had no idea when I asked that the answer was already on her way, walking across half a country to find me. And I am thinking that I have spent 22 years trying to find a way to thank him, and I have not yet found a way that feels equal to the gift. You are the gift," she said, "not me. We are each other's gift." He turned his head to look at her. The setting sun was on her face. The honey blonde of her hair had silvered, but the cornflower blue of her eyes had not changed at all in 22 years. And he saw in those eyes the same small woman he had carried out of a freight wagon on a cold October night in 1878. And he saw also the wife and the mother and the teacher and the strong frontier woman she had become. And he saw all of them at once the way a man sees all the seasons of a tree when he has watched it stand in the same field for 22 years. "I love you, Cordelia." "Ashbury," he said. "I know," said his wife. "I have known it since the morning I asked you what your decency cost. You have been answering me ever since. Every single day." Down in the yard, a small, barefoot figure came running up the path from the schoolhouse. It was Thatcher's youngest cousin, Briggs's little daughter, 5 years old, and red-haired like her mother, and breathless with the importance of her errand. "Uncle Holden," she said. "Aunt Cordelia. Uncle Wesson says supper is ready, and we are not allowed to eat it without you." Holden smiled. He stood up slowly from the rocking chair, his old knee protesting just a little. He held out his hand to his wife. She took it. They walked together down the porch steps and across the yard toward the second house on the mountain, where the rest of the family was waiting around a long pine table for them. Behind them on the porch, the two rocking chairs rocked very gently in the cooling October wind, the way two old friends rock when they have known each other for a long time, and there is nothing left to say. And if you had been standing in that yard at that moment, friend, and if you had looked up at the high peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains as the last copper light went out of them and the first cold star came out over the eastern ridge, you would have understood why a man once stood in that exact same yard and shouted 3 words at the sky. And you would have understood also why those 3 words had been answered the way they had. Because some prayers are not answered in the moment they are spoken. Some prayers are answered slowly across years in the small daily kindnesses of a life shared with the right person. Some prayers are answered in the way a wife reaches for her husband's hand without looking. In the laugh of a quiet brother who has finally remembered how to laugh. In the wildflowers a man leaves on a windowsill without ever once saying who put them there. Some prayers are answered in the building of a home. A long time after that October evening, when the children had all grown and the grandchildren had started to come, Cordelia Ashbury would die in her own bed in the cabin on the mountain, with her hand in her husband's hand the way her hand had been in his hand every night for many, many years. And not many seasons after that, Holden himself would go on a cold, clear morning on the same porch where he had once shouted at the sky with Wesson and Briggs sitting beside him and the Bitterroot Mountains turning gold in the rising sun. They were buried side by side on a small rise above the ranch, looking out over the meadow where the first cattle had grazed. The headstone was simple. It had only their names and their dates, and below those 2 small words that the family had chosen because 2 words were all that was needed to say what had happened on this mountain. Answered prayers. The cabin still stands, friend. The wildflowers still come up on the slope behind it every spring. And on quiet October evenings when the light slants gold across the Bitterroot Valley and the wind comes down off the high country very softly, the people who live there now will sometimes tell you, if you ask about the man who once stood in that yard and asked God to send him someone, and about the woman who walked 4,000 miles to be the answer. Thank you for sitting with me tonight. Thank you for listening to this old story all the way to the end. If it moved you, I would be grateful if you would tap the like button so other folks can find it. Drop a comment and tell me where you are listening from. And if you are new here, hit subscribe because I tell stories like this one every week, and I would love to have you come back. Until next time, friend, take care of the people you love, and remember that the best prayers in this life are the ones you do not even know you have prayed until the answer is standing on your porch in the firelight, waiting for you to open the door.